They have presented two visions of government. One vision was described that of a secret government, directed principally by NSC staffers, accountable to not a single elected official, including apparently the president himself. A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself. It is an elitist vision of government that trusts no one, not the people, not the Congress, and not the cabinet. It is a vision of a government operated by persons convinced they have a monopoly on truth, maintain that Congress had no meaningful role in foreign policy, and act secure in the belief that the president would have approved the diversion of funds. I believe we have largely succeeded in piecing together the incredible chapters of this chilling story.
When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order.
Or an endless, enduring dream and 1,000 points of light. This is my mission, and I will complete it.
Sustainable development. We set aside the skepticism. We see you. We hear you.
And now is a time when things are shifting. There's going to be a new world order out there.
We must treat this new world order.
It is a new world order with significantly different and radically new challenges.
Never before has a new world order had to be assembled from so many different perceptions.
Subject to unseen distortions and subtle manipulations. Lies, conspiracy theories, junk science, quackery. And over time, we lose our capacity to distinguish between fact and wholesale fiction. We control them, and we can remake them.
He was more capable of running intelligence activities than the CIA that would conduct covert operations. That this all sounded like a good idea. I believe these hearings will be remembered longest for the extraordinary and extraordinarily frightening views of government they exposed, and for riding roughshod over the constitutional restraints built into our form of government. This is a dangerous world, they said. That, my fellow citizens, is an excuse for autocracy, not for policy. Because no times were more dangerous than when our country was born, when revolution was our midwife. Times hardly less challenging than our own present. It must be safeguarded, particularly when times are dangerous and the temptation to arrogate power is the greatest. Without our principles and without our ideals, we have little that is special or worthy to defend. History records that almost 200 years ago in September of 1787, as the Constitutional Convention was finishing its business, a bystander asked Benjamin Franklin, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" And Dr. Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." By allowing the sunlight on this unseemly affair, and by showing what happens when policy is conceived and executed by cabal and not by lawful consensus, we have tried to make our contribution to keeping it. For in America, as 200 years ago, the people still rule.
The city, the state, and the county of LA wanted to shut Grace Church down. We sued them to stay open. We didn't accept any of the mandates, no masks, no distancing, no nothing. We were the church. The end of the case was that the state of California, the county of Los Angeles, said to us, "We are giving you a permanent exemption from any invasion of the civil authorities again in the future of Grace Community Church." How could they possibly go from wanting to shut us down to giving a permanent injunction against that in the future? Because the one thing they could not afford to have was the truth. The reason it worked was because we didn't bend. You know, they would come back and say, "Okay, just do masks. And I said, no. And they say, well, just social distance. No. Well, just take everybody's temperature at the gate. No. We'll just have one entrance. No. Don't sing. No. Don't hug. No. And why did I say no all the time? Because you're not the head of the church.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Armor of Truth Live, number 253. That was a little preview video that we put together yesterday to set up today's show. And I'll tell you what, is it not fascinating? Not many people know, because it's not a story that's been covered in the news that much, that Gavin Newsom, more specifically, it was L.A. County, who went after churches in a very direct way. It happened all over the country. Happened in Canada as well. What's really interesting about that is that as long as MacArthur said, as long as they didn't give in to any of the arbitrary requests, arbitrary mandates, that's a bit of an oxymoron, but that's what they were. They were requiring people to do things based on what they thought was right or what they wanted to accomplish. Well, he didn't give in to any of them at any time. To give in to one of them would be to affirm that there's some truth there. But what's fascinating is that when it got to the point, after fines and lawsuits, when it got to the point where the health officials, the health authorities were going to be called to testify, they stopped. They shut it down because they could not afford to have their true purposes in these mandates revealed. Summer, you were talking earlier about how we wanted to clarify.
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that people knew that Grace Church was instrumental in standing their ground, and that when it came time for the courts for them to go to court, they couldn't risk there being any question in the mind of the public of what their motives were and who their experts were. So it would have, put everything for the world to see potentially, and exposed. So then, it would have exposed just the blaringly obvious gaps of their logic. And so they decided to recoil and retreat. And so that's pretty incredible.
It is. It's an amazing story. And it's, as MacArthur said there, it's not about us. It's not about him. This was where the church prevailed against the state. And that's because Jesus Christ is the head of the church. Not John MacArthur, Amen. Not any man. And Jesus Christ you see in Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, where Jesus Christ is the creator. All things were created through him. He's the head of the church. The governments that we have, even though they go left of center, they go off the rails, they're instituted by God. And that's because the heart of man is the truth is coming into the world, light is coming into the world, but men's hearts love darkness. That's the judgment.
So the powers that be, they didn't want to risk the truth coming out about the deception.
Right. Yeah, that's a good
point.
So
that is really interesting that they actually said, okay, you guys can open no matter what.
Yeah, what that meant was anytime in the future that they are exempt from mandates. It's an amazing thing to have had happen. Okay, so let's get in now. If you can see, sure. Be not a cancer on the earth. This is the way it's understood today among our leaders and the scientific elite. And this is the message from the Georgia Guidestones has really never been more obvious, right? That this is their worldview. This is their 10 Commandments. More specifically, this part here. Maintain humanity under whatever number it could be, but
500 million.
But today the number, as of 1973, the number was they determined we can't get over 8 million, specifically 8.3 billion. We can't let it get that.
8.3 billion.
Yeah, I'd be size of New York. But 8.3 billion was the number established in 1973 by those advising the governments on what we could handle, right?
Right, and remember we were talking about how you pointed out that just as the population supposedly got to 8.3 is when we started seeing all this stuff roll out.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to go through a timeline today for you because something interesting happened in 2021 when the global population eclipsed 8 billion. I haven't counted them. I don't know, but that's what we're told anyway, that we're somewhere around 8 billion. It's over 8 billion now, they say. I don't know. But that's when, 2020 was the year of the virus, the illness. And then 2021 really was the year of the rollout of the treatment, the inoculation. And that's when we saw strange things happening. Is there, in fact, a depopulation agenda at work? Today's title is Climate, Viruses, and Emergency Powers, the backbone of hidden government. We've seen this before. And the video, the clip we started with today, the full video is available on our channel. It's about 8 minutes long. We've seen this before, where the executive branch of the federal government has given itself powers over the decades so that now they can effectively make policy. They can establish law without having to be checked by the Congress, by the legislative branch. We have 3 branches, an executive branch. That's where the president and all his advisors are. He's also the commander-in-chief of our armed forces. And then we have a legislative branch, that's the Congress, and the senators, those are the people who come together and introduce and debate laws and pass laws. Then we have the judicial, which is the Supreme Court. We're going to be talking about all 3 of those today because we want you to understand exactly what's at play here. These are not conspiracy theories. These are conspiracies. They're happening. Let's start off with, it also says there on the guidestones, as you can see, to guide reproduction wisely. Improving fitness and diversity. That specifically means eugenics. To improve fitness, that means to only allow those to reproduce that should reproduce. All right. Now, I wanted to mention just a couple ideas before we start today. The reason that this is able to work, the reason that people are afraid of death, that they're afraid of viruses, the reason that people can be herded like cattle today through fear. This is basically an element of the worldview at work in the people that we see running these agendas. Specifically today, we're talking about hidden government, the depopulation version, dialectical materialism. This is the idea, you've heard it before, thesis. There is the way things are. This is how it is. That is the thesis. And then comes an antithesis, a challenge to the order. And then through these 2 things, battling it out, you get a synthesis. There's a new way. So this is Karl Marx essentially presented this as an economic theory of how the upper class and the lower classes battle, and then some synthesis comes forward. It's probably first introduced by Hegel. But more specifically, today it was used then to describe the way things evolve socially, economically, and historically. Specifically, I think it's more historical, the way that Hegel was talking about. So today, though, what we see is a group, a person, an elite, people who are in position to do these things, they have a dream for the way they want things to be. For instance, let's say we want population to be where we think it should be. It should be back down to 7 billion. We got to take it down. That would be the synthesis that we're looking for. And the way it is now, it's over 8 billion. So we need to get it down by a little over 1 billion people. All right, well, they will present, they have a way to do that. That's the goal, that's what they want. And so they present an antithesis to the way things are. And then people cry out for a solution, which they already have ready. That's a general explanation. But to the dialectical materialist, this is someone who doesn't really believe in transcendental authority. There's nothing but matter and energy at work. Matter and energy are truth to these people, right? That is why they appeal to the science as though that is the truth. That is the ultimate truth. And so class struggle drives history. And it's matter and energy battling. And economics is a means of controlling people. We've described that pretty well. The idea is that the methods of science are the only means by which any knowledge or relevant truth may be gained. So it's the truth to these people that population must be controlled. It must be at this number or less. And we're the ones who determine that. We are the enlightened ones. And it's our moral, it's our purpose. It's our duty, our moral duty, they believe, to run these plans and these agendas because they feel like they're the enlightened ones. They know how it should be. Okay? But game over. Charles Darwin, that theory, that worldview is so severely flawed. We hope we've made this case over and over. We've got videos about this here. Darwinism and all that. We're not here to talk about evolution today. Today we're going to talk about this depopulation agenda that's at work in our world. Can we remind you right now to go ahead and please download the Armor of Truth mobile app. It is very important that you do that. This will be the way when they come after us, and they will, that we'll be able to communicate with you and provide content for you as we keep an eye on things that are going on. We'll come back to this a little later in the show and give you some more details about that. The Armor of Truth mobile app. Please subscribe to our backup YouTube channel, or it's called True Normal TV. And visit armoroftruth.net for much more information that you can read there. Okay. If the world is against truth, I'm against the world. And that's the stance that we have to have. That's Athanasius of Alexandria in his seminal work, Athanasius Contra Munda, Against the World. Now, what we've seen happen in the news recently is that Joe Biden has picked a retired major general to lead the new White House Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response Policy. And it's a group called the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense interviewed the general the other day. We got some good information out of that. This is Paul Friedrich's son. Do you have his basic bio close at hand?
Yes.
Well, it comes from the Department of Defense, and why this is interesting is what our show's about today. We see where the executive branch of the government has been caught at times. It happened during the Reagan administration and during Obama's administration, where the executive office was caught just ruling by decree. We're going to talk about Obama and the Paris Climate Accord a little bit later, about how he got us into that going around Congress. You got it?
Well, I mean, we know that he is currently the special assistant to the president, right?
Yeah, he's already in that office.
Yeah,
right, in the executive branch.
And as well, Senior Director of Global Health Security and Biodefense at the White House, so National Security Council. And he's got quite the credentials through the years. I mean, he's several decades in, and he's medically trained, and he's been a colonel and a general and a lieutenant, and he's got the stars and all of that. And he's now heading up the Office of Pandemic Preparedness that is going to be a permanent office at the White House.
In the executive branch, as you heard Summer say there, he is a member of the National Security Council. What that is, it's a body of advisors that advise the president. Now, in the opening clip, that was Senator Daniel Inouye from Hawaii at the Iran-Contra hearings. That National Security Council, that is the foundation of that's what we're looking at, because that is where the depopulation agenda began. In 1973, depopulation became official U.S. policy. That's not a theory. That's just the way it is. That's just the truth. And we'll show you how that happened as we move through today's show. What's interesting about this blue ribbon panel to study on biodefense is, let's see, Joe Lieberman is one of the co-chairs there. And the other co-chair is Tom Ridge. Tom Ridge was the first, it was appointed by George W. Bush after 9/11 when the new Department of Homeland Security was created, something we didn't need, we still don't need. Tom Ridge was appointed the first director. But the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense is a privately funded entity. It's not a government organization. It's a private entity established in 2014 to provide a comprehensive assessment of the state of U.S. biodefense efforts. Right? They want to protect us from diseases and biowarfare and things like that. But what if the biowarfare is coming from us? It's coming from our own agencies. So let's see here. Where do we want to go next with this? Well, I think we covered Friedrichs pretty well in 251, AOT Live 251. I played a clip from the hearing where we got to hear Friedrichs talk, and I think maybe today all we'll play is this clip where one of the members of this body, Donna Shalala, these are all former politicians, former senators and congressmen and agency heads.
This is the one that was the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that's the YouTube channel.
Yep. Just a quick clip here to listen to, because what we've told you here, the evidence we've shown you, well, it's just a fact that the Department of Defense ran Operation Warp Speed. And when they did that, why that's significant is because they're not healthcare experts. You know, they ordered a countermeasure to stop the virus. That's the cover story anyway. But a countermeasure is a weapon. What we need to be clear that we understand is who's the enemy. Right? Is the virus the enemy, or are the people the enemy? Was the virus was the jab created to stop the spread, or was it created to do something else? Who's the enemy? But just to give people some evidence as to yes, in fact, it was run out of the D.O.D. Let's just listen to this short exchange.
I feel like I should stand up now.
We all should.
Thank you. I had one of the things that we observed during COVID was that Operation Warp Speed was, while it was designed and the White House played a significant role, as did HHS, it was actually executed by the Defense Department. And it turns out, what we should have known from the beginning, that the Defense Department has a capacity for execution, for procurement, that other agencies don't really have when you're dealing with a national emergency. To what extent, as you're thinking through preparedness, are you thinking, one of the things I worry about is that we're going to spread these responsibilities all over the place when we really have a set of skills that already exist in defense. How are you thinking about that?
Well, I'll have to start with the disclaimer that I have a 37-year bias because of my time in uniform on this one. So, a couple of immediate thoughts on that. The Department of Defense is just that. It is designed and tasked to do very specific defense-related activities.
Now, that's a very important statement. That is all the way true. What business does the DOD have of running vaccine procurement and dissemination?
I think we should, as a nation, carefully consider whether we also want the Department of Defense to become the Department of PPE procurement and the Department of flu vaccine development and testing and a myriad of other things which currently reside in other agencies. My personal opinion on this, and there's been suggestions made on this already, some of those acquisition authorities that enabled Operation Warp Speed are specific to DOD, and the alternative to making DOD the Department of Health Defense or of vaccine procurement is instead to provide those contracting authorities and acquisition authorities to HHS. And that's part of what I think we need to continue to discuss as we go forward is where does that responsibility best lie, and then align the authorities with the responsibilities. I'm choosing my words a little bit carefully because...
Okay. And he's right about this. The DOD doesn't really shouldn't be running things like this. Shouldn't be running vaccine procurement, vaccine development. He shouldn't be running. And he's right. So he's right there. But what is the answer? Well, the answer, that according to the Biden administration, is to bring the DOD into the president's personal sphere of influence. To bring someone like Friedrichs right on into
this permanent office.
It's a permanent office, and it's a permanent office inside the executive office of the president. So it's part of the National Security Council. This is dangerous. This is very dangerous. And all you have to do is study the Iran-Contra affair to know why. All you have to do is study Barack Obama bringing us into the Paris Climate Accords to understand why. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I was also going to say it's just a strange coincidence, right, that August 7th was the day that this office officially opened, the Pandemic Preparedness Office. And on August 7th as well, over across the pond in the UK, you have a facility that opened on August 7th as well, which is going to be dealing with pandemic preparedness. So that's a little tidbit for you.
It's all happening. It's all happening. All right. That brings us to the actual start of part one of our show today. This is Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch. I forgot his first name. Neil Gorsuch. Now, Time magazine has called Justice Gorsuch one of the most divisive justices ever. He is, they say, certainly he's the most divisive justice on the Supreme Court today. Well, in a statement that came last May in response to what was a Republican-led effort to extend Title 42, which is an immigration policy. Just to let you know, what that case was about the border. It was about the endless flow, just opening the borders and letting anyone and everyone just come right on in without any vetting. And the people who live at the border, it's not good. They're like, hang on a minute. We want to be helpful, but this is crazy. It's not just people from Mexico or Guatemala that come across the border. It's the Chinese. If you didn't realize, there was a huge movement of Chinese nationals gathering and coming across the border. So that's what this was. So the case was the people of Arizona versus Alejandro Mayorkas, the Secretary of Homeland Security. So that's the context. But what he said was, he made it clear about where he stands on pandemic emergency response and emergency decrees, because that's what happened. Because of an emergency decree by the Homeland Security, they're the ones who decided to just let the doors open, just to open up the borders and let anyone and everyone come across. Now, we're Christians, right? We don't believe in harming people. We don't believe in shutting people out. That's not our position. But we live in a nation, and our nation has laws that are for the public good. And one of those has always been that you can't just cross the border and come in and take advantage of the systems of the United States, the systems that are there, without at least knocking, without at least going through the process that everyone else goes through. So we believe, as Christians, we believe in the rule of law, because God is the initiator of that. It starts with the Lord. Okay, but he said this. This is what he said in relation to all the tyranny that we saw in 2020. He said, since March 2020, we may have experienced the greatest intrusion on civil liberties in the peacetime history of this country. Executive officials across the country issued emergency decrees on a breathtaking scale. Governors and local leaders imposed lockdown orders forcing people to remain in their homes. They shuttered businesses and schools, public and private. They closed churches, even while they allowed casinos, brothels to carry on. They threatened violators, not just with civil penalties, but with criminal sanctions. They surveilled church parking lots, recorded license plates, and issued notices warning that attendance at even outdoor services could amount to criminal conduct. They divided cities and neighborhoods into color-coded zones, forced individuals to fight for their freedoms in court on emergency timetables, and then changed their color-coded schemes when defeat in court seemed imminent. Now, this is exactly what we just laid out for you with Grace Community Church in Sun Valley, California. Federal executive officials deployed a public health agency to regulate landlord-tenant relations nationwide. They used Workplace Safety Agency, that was OSHA, to issue a vaccination mandate for most working Americans. They threatened to fire non-compliant employees and warned that service members who refused to vaccinate might face dishonorable discharge and jail time. Along the way, it seems federal officials may have pressured social media companies to suppress information. This is the case of Missouri versus Biden that we've talked about here, where lawyers, where the people from Missouri and Louisiana have come together now in a class action lawsuit against the Biden administration for their actions, in their support of censorship. While executive officials issued new emergency decrees at a furious pace, state legislators and Congress, the bodies normally responsible for adopting our laws, too often fell silent. This is what happened when Barack Obama put us into the Paris Climate Accords. He went around the Congress, and the Congress said and did nothing. Gorsuch goes on to say, let me move ahead. He warns that when people are afraid and they cry for change, save us, that this is how government can become tyrannical. It can become an irresistible force, like rule by decree. So he goes on to talk about, in his statement, about in the 1970s, Congress studied the use of emergency decrees. Now, we talked about this in an article, the article that's on our Substack by Summer. Did you put that in the?
Yes, it's underneath the description, the video description.
We actually have quite a few links in the description today, don't we, for people to check out?
Mm-hmm. If you look to the section where it says timeline of events and how we got to now, you'll see 2 links under there to our Substack, which talk about this very thing.
Excellent. All right. So that's what in the 70s it was noticed, right? Look, there's a problem here. Presidents and agencies are declaring public emergencies or national emergencies or public health emergencies, and then taking advantage of the powers that clothes them in, right? They're misusing, they're abusing their power. And in the 70s, when Congress studied this, they observed that that these declarations can allow executive authorities to tap into extraordinary powers. Congress also observed that emergency decrees have a habit of long outliving the crisis that generated them. Some federal emergency proclamations have remained in effect for years or decades after the emergency in question has passed. An example we give in the article is the emergency declaration George W. Bush declared a national emergency with regard to domestic terrorism. It's still in effect. I think we're out of 9/11 now, right? That's over. That threat, that happened. But because it's not just these things just remain there and nobody does anything. Every year they have to be renewed. And so our leaders are seeing it and thinking about it, and for some reason they're deciding, it's because they become attached to some other bill. That's very important, and this is stuck in the back. And a lot of times they don't see it. Congress recognized that quick unilateral executive action is sometimes necessary and permitted in our constitutional order, and we would agree. We would want our governments, we would want our leaders to be aware and to be able to protect our land, to protect our nation, to do the right thing. In an effort to balance these considerations and ensure a more normal operation of our laws and firmer protection of our liberties, Congress adopted a number of new guardrails in the National Emergencies Act. But, as you'll see in our article, it did not fix the problem. Despite that law, the number of declared emergencies has only grown in the ensuing years. I think as we sit here today, there are more than 30 national emergencies currently in effect. Folks, this is how leaders, this is how men with nefarious designs take control. This is how they get around the law. It's hard to not wonder whether nearly after half a century, 50 years, and in light of our nation's recent experience, maybe we should look at this again. Maybe we should take some of those powers away. Rule by indefinite emergency edict risks leaving all of us with a shell of democracy and civil liberties. Now, as loathsome as this behavior is, taking advantage of public health emergencies and national emergencies, there is a much darker side to all of this. And that is this. For more than 50 years, population control and depopulation have been the official U.S. government policy. At the same time, various international institutions committed to global governance, from the United Nations to the World Economic Forum, of course, they've also been pushing forward an array of thinly veiled extermination agendas. Let's not mince words. That's not there as a sensational term. Right? We're not talking just about lockdowns and tyranny here. We're talking about extermination agenda. When Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, was published in 1968, it fed into a growing panic that overpopulation would doom the planet by stripping the earth of its resources. Ehrlich and others presented apocalyptic scenarios and projections that famine and disease would end humanity. Thus, environmental activism was born, and environmental activism was born out of fear. But the world did not end. All those predictions made in 1968 and in the early 70s with the Club of Rome. And after several more of their failed predictions, the activism still hasn't waned. And that's because it's useful for financial gain, and it's useful for gaining more power. In fact, today, environmental activism has grown into both a fanatical religion and a new market for wealthy opportunists. For over 50 years, powerful factions, institutions, and governments have most certainly been engaged in, at best, population control. At worst, they've been involved in mass murder. Strong terms, but it's the truth. When a relatively small cabal lusts after control of a nation or considers themselves the anointed saviors, the enlightened utilitarians of planet Earth, understand that a plan that big, that overarching requires focus. It requires a great amount of patience. It requires a 100-year-long plan. It requires organization. And it requires the sacrifice of many people. Now let's look at this. This is from Reuters. This article is from 2020. 270 million people face starvation today. All right, says the World Food Program. David Beasley from the World Food Program headquarters in Rome received a Nobel Prize in 2020. We'll listen to some of his words. Listen to this here. He's going to tell you why we have these problems.
To end conflict and to create stability and peace. We believe food is the pathway to peace. This Nobel Peace Prize is more than a thank you. It is a call to action. Because of so many wars, climate change, the widespread use of hunger as a political and military weapon, and a global health pandemic that makes all of that exponentially worse, 270 million people are marching towards starvation. Failure to address their needs will cause a hunger pandemic which will dwarf the impact of COVID. And after a century of massive strides in eliminating extreme poverty, today those 200 million of our neighbors are on the brink of starvation. That's more than the entire population of Western Europe. In the spirit of Alfred Nobel, as inscribed on this medal, peace and brotherhood, let's feed them all.
Remember what we just described to you, how this dialectical materialism works out, how the process of dialectic, when it's applied to social matters, when it's applied to society, when it's applied to the population problem, as they'll call it, you present a problem. It doesn't have to be real, right? One thing about the enlightened utilitarians of the world, they feel they have the authority and that they should, whenever they deem necessary, deceive the public for the greater good. Beasley goes on here to say, at the end, he says, and if that's not bad enough, out of that 270 million, 30 million of them depend on us 100% for their survival. Well, now, how did that happen? How did that happen? Now, what the truth is, the population does appear to be slowing significantly since 2021. But why? Why has population stopped growing so fast? Is it just a natural occurrence? What changed? All right, what was new and different about 2021? Let's look at this article from. This article is about from the Center Square. It's a publication from Indiana. Indiana life insurance CEO says deaths, and when he says deaths here, let's qualify, he means excess deaths, are up 40% among people ages 18 to 64. Now, what is this all about? One America is a $100 billion insurance company, headquartered in Indianapolis, Indiana, since 1877. All right, so this is not some flaky company. They've been around. They have approximately 2,400 employees, and they sell life insurance and life insurance products like group life insurance and stuff like that to employers nationwide. In January 2022, One America CEO Scott Davison publicly disclosed a shocking statistic that emerged between July and December of 2021. He says, if I can find the quote here, I'll just read it for you. Scott Davison said, "We're seeing right now the highest death rates we have seen in the history of this business." Full stop. Right? Okay. I'm listening. He said, in the history of this business, we've seen nothing like this. And it's not just at our company. The data is consistent across every player in this field. He says this, quote, "Death rates are up 40% higher than before the pandemic." And this is a very important part. He says it's not elderly people who are dying at this abnormal rate. It's primarily working age people, 18 to 64, who are the employees of companies that have group life insurance plans through One America. He goes on to say, just to give you an idea of how bad that is, this is a once in 200 year catastrophe. No, he says, sorry, a 1 in 200 year catastrophe would be a 10% increase, right, of excess death. So 40% increase since pre-pandemic is unheard of. There is nothing to compare this to. Most of the claims for deaths being filed are not classified as COVID-19 deaths. Right? It's some other problem. He said at the same time, the company is seeing an uptick in disability claims, saying at first it was short-term disability, but now it's increased into long-term disability claims. He said for the week ending November 6, 2021, there were far fewer deaths from the virus in Indiana compared to the previous year. It was like 195 to 336, right? They had 195 by November deaths in 2021 at November, where the year before it was 336. But more deaths from other causes, to the tune of 1,350 versus the prior year, 1,320. So it's going up. The extraordinary high death rate, quoted here by Davidson, matched also what hospitals in Indiana are reporting. Dr. Lindsay Weaver, Indiana's chief medical officer, said in 2021 the number of hospitalizations in Indiana was higher than before the COVID-19 vaccine was introduced a year prior. Higher than the previous 5 years. In November 2021, the majority of ICU beds were not taken up by coronavirus patients, just 37%, while 54% of the ICU beds are being occupied by people with other illnesses or conditions. See, this is more than what's normal. Mark Oshinsky, writing for the Brownstone Institution, said, "I suspect these deaths derive from the jabs and such lingering the reactions or the reverberation of the problems of lockdowns and mandates, things like that have affected stuff like substance abuse and depression, weight gain and impoverishment." Now, there is speculation. Some of you have to help me with this. The Deagle report.
Yes.
Give us just what is it? Now, this speculation, because it's not easy to verify a lot about the Deagle report. But
well, it does show up in the Wayback Machine.
Okay.
It's actually something that I've heard about for years and years and years.
Yeah.
Some people will say that it was only popular on the internet in 2020, but actually I remember hearing about it long before that. But I will throw in a bit of caution because, for example, like, I know that David Icke is somebody who talks about this. So, we know that David Icke is controlled opposition.
He's a very convenient boogeyman he is. A lot of stuff he says is completely insane, but that doesn't mean that everything he says
That's right.
is wrong.
Not everything that he says is wrong. So the Deagle Corporation is a is a minor branch of the U.S. Military intelligence, one of many secretive organizations which collect data for high-level decision-making purposes and prepares confidential briefing documents for agencies like National Security Agency, the United Nations, and the World Bank. So they came out saying that they've also done other reports for them in the past, which lends to the credibility that they have. Deagle predicted that that by 2025, for example, the United Kingdom would have a 77% decline in population. The United States by 2025 would have a 68.5% decline in population. Germany would see 65.1% decline in population. Australia, 34.6% decline in population. And there's a list of the countries, primarily Western countries. Is this a shocker? No, actually. Definitely very scary. Very, very scary. And if you look at that in tandem with what's happening with what you've just been reporting on.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The year that they're all pointing to there would be 2025. And by itself, it doesn't make a case for anything by itself. But when you start gathering up the evidence, we start to see something is true here.
Well, this is like one of those moments, remember Y2K?
Yeah.
You know, like there have been different moments where they're like, oh, this is coming, and then it never comes. But however, honestly, you could actually say that this is like an event 201, like the way that they ran that simulation, the Deagle put their report out, and this in fact is true, and nobody will know until 2025 comes.
With strange times. We're not going to do this report today. I might do it for you soon. But I've got an article here and a very interesting line of research and a line of evidence presented here by Michael Singer at the Brownstone Institute, asking the question, was the COVID response a coup, which means a takeover, by the Western intelligence community? Questions like this: how were officials able to implement such destructive totalitarian policies across the Western world without our intelligence agencies getting involved and saying anything? How was it possible that agency heads were able to lock down cities and cause such harm, and none of the systems that are in place to prevent this worked? The response to COVID led directly back to the Western intelligence community itself. When you follow the evidence, and he's made a very, very good case. He said the Western intelligence community was behind the birth of social distancing as a public health policy. Via Richard Hatchett and Carter Metcher, operatives with deep ties to the highest levels of the intelligence and biosecurity communities through their work on biodefense policy during the Bush administration. Now, in that video I played earlier for you that Summer found this was where Paul Friedrichs is being interviewed by that
the bipartisan committee, on biodefense.
Yeah, he mentioned, he read, if you could see the two books that were sitting on the desk there, if they're still there, let's see.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, there you go. Those two books there, those are reports, one from 2006 and one from 2015 of something just like this, an Office of Pandemic Preparedness or Biodefense. So this is, none of this is new. The New York Times put out an elaborate cover story for the fact that the concept was lifted directly from China's long-standing policy of lockdown during SARS in 2003. By the way, when you look at Event 201 and also the Dark Winter, Event 201 and Dark Winter were tabletop what would you call it? Not experiments, but
tabletop exercises.
Exercises. There we go. Wow. tabletop exercises
okay.
for a pandemic. What would we do if it happened? Now, once again, by itself, you would want your officials to have a plan. Now, that's good, right? But there's many things about it that are pretty strange. I've talked about that a lot here. We won't get into that in detail right here. But he says the intelligence community either planned or was in attendance at nearly all of the pandemic simulations that began being held on a semi-annual basis beginning with Dark Winter in 2001. Current Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines was personally present and sat directly beside China's CDC director at Event 201, which was a simulation of a coronavirus pandemic, which took place weeks before COVID was revealed. Now, this goes on and makes a very interesting case. We'll share this with you at a later point just to keep this show to a reasonable length, and because that deserves a more careful examination. But keep that in mind. Is it possible? All right. Well, there's Gorsuch again. Oh, there we go. I got it back. Here we go. Now, Representative Thomas Massey from Kentucky was he's a congressman from Kentucky, one of the very few representatives that saw the coup, the takeover of the federal government as it was happening beginning in March of 2020. He saw it, and he worked hard to stand for the Constitution in the face of even heavy attacks from both parties. Let's just remind you, a lot of us have forgotten. I know I've put it out of my mind. In 2020, really beginning in February, when the NCAA tournament was called off, it was shut down. That was like early March, actually. But it was apocalyptic. You could drive down major highways, like around here. Our major highway would be interstate would be I-40, which goes from the East Coast to the West Coast. Goes from Wilmington, North Carolina to Barstow, California. And so we're on I-40 a lot around here. And there were signs, warning people, stay home, stay off the interstate. Strange, you hear in the movie, the Essential Church movie, you hear one of the elders there talking about driving in to work in Los Angeles or Sun Valley, which is just outside of Los Angeles. How strange, how apocalyptic it was to see nobody on the freeways in L.A. So what we're going to do is share a couple comments from this congressman here who's going to tell you what he saw while this was all going down. What you got?
Oh, I was just saying that when I was living in Asia, I was in Asia at this time, and normally in Bali and Indonesia, there's just a boatload of people. The streets are always congested, and it was completely apocalyptic, because I remember all of the roads, literally, like, people had newspaper on the windows and garbage bags on the windows of shops. And it was just desolate. Nobody out, no business happening. Crazy. Incredible. Yeah. It was straight out of The Walking Dead or something.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, I'm and I know some are the same way here. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it's just when I started this channel years ago. One of my main focuses was the vaccine agenda. Way before any of this happened, is I've kind of been in that camp for a long time now because of the work I used to do, speech therapy with a lot of children who were developing, and well, you hear, you see when you go case by case, you can see that there's a big problem there. But when this all happened, right from like the first report, it just for some reason, just knew this is not.
Yeah, I remember thinking.
Wrong.
I remember thinking, this is it. They're doing it.
Yeah.
This is the one. This is the operation.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Jason. Big Jason Casper out there again. Thank you, brother, for that support.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
If you'd like to support what we're doing, you can use what YouTube has available there. If that's easier for you, you can do super chats or do super thanks. You can, even on older videos, there's a way to do a donation like that. You can follow the links under the in the description of this video. We'll give you more information about how to support us in just a bit. But thank you for that. That's extremely helpful. Helps us to plan what we're going to do. We want to be here to serve you for as long as we can. So let's listen to a couple comments here from Representative Thomas Massey from Kentucky. Seems like a true. It seems like one of the guys who's actually taking his job seriously and cares about the country, loves the country, keeps God first, and understands what government is and that it needs to be limited.
Will be fatal with, and so I made some quick estimates and some assumptions. My assumptions, were probably too rosy even. And I later that week or that day, I broke it to my staff. I told them, I said, I've done some math. This is not 15 days. And
that's to flatten the curve.
So on Easter, our governors sent out state troopers to take down the license plates of people who defied him to go to church. But and also there was a woman who tested positive for COVID in Kentucky, and they wanted her to sign a document to say that she wouldn't leave the state, she wouldn't leave her house. And she agreed not to leave her house, but she refused to sign a document. She thought, well, what if I have to go, if there's an emergency, life or death situation? They sent police to her house and put an ankle bracelet on her in Kentucky to track her. And so, all of these.
We covered that story here. I remember us talking about that. That was a lady in Kentucky. And that's where he is. That's his constituency.
Horrific things we saw on the news happening in China were happening in the United States. Meanwhile, Jeffrey, and again, we're in,
Pardon me for a second. In that report, we're going to give you about answering the question whether or not this was a coup by a Western intelligence community. We actually have some evidence now to show where a lot of the videos coming out of China that showed people leaping out of their apartment buildings and a lot of things like that were actually
operations.
Yeah, they were actually operations, and the origin of those videos has, although it's you can't be sure about where it comes from. It's based on the context all around it. You can see that it was most likely produced to foment the fear, to help for people in the United States to be scared.
Remember, too, we were talking about also the involvement of Kissinger over in China, and so his influence. And actually, you could argue that the involvement that Kissinger has had in China that was really the first sort of experimental testing ground.
Yeah, as we're going to get to here in just a minute, the actual depopulation policy of the United States, it began in 1973, originated from something called the Kissinger Report.
Right.
And so he was in the National Security Council at that time. So
and as well, one more thing too, Larry Fink and BlackRock and their involvement in China as well, being
they're the very first foreign to China to be allowed to work in the Chinese fund, the fund that they have, their investment funds. They're the first to be allowed in that system.
Correct.
Okay, let's here's the representative is going to mention something about the government initiating continuity of government plans and trying to keep all of the representatives out of Washington.
Get us back to about the fourth day of 15 to slow the spread. We're being told we're going to vote on a giant spending package. And, the numbers were changing. We weren't sure what the numbers would be. How much would the money be? And I was waiting. I was on call. I was ready to come to D.C. and debate that and vote on that. And meanwhile, they were making preparations for continuity of government. Now, this is where things are going to sound conspiratorial, but I can point you back to articles that show what was happening. In the event that the branches of government quit functioning, there's sort of a military government that would take over in this country to maintain law and order. And they were making preparations for that. And they were telling people, if you remember also, not to leave your state. There was a discussion whether to shut down all the New England states, whether basically to stop all traffic in and out of New York State. There were discussions, serious discussions about that. You can go back in the news and find these things.
Yeah. Can we just go back? So
yeah.
March 12th.
Okay, so we've got other quotes, but did you see that? I showed you there. This is whitehouse.gov. And you would expect your government to have some contingency in place if our leadership was decapitated, right? In other words, if they attacked our leadership and just took out Washington D.C. and the president and his cabinet, what do? You've got to have a plan in place for that, right? Well, that's one thing. It's one thing to have a plan in place for that. It's another thing to take advantage of a good plan and to turn it for your own gain, to use it as a way to grab power. Right. So this is the continuity of government plan on the whitehouse.gov website, and you can check that out. Continuity of government. You'll find it. It's easy to find. And here's some of the levels of when certain things are started. But what's interesting here that I thought I'd share with you very quickly here. There's no need to go into this too deeply at the moment, but you get the process of evacuating the president here. They don't tell you the process. They tell you what they're going to do. But after several days in the air, the president could choose to go to one of the presidential emergency facilities at Mount Weather. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, that big conspiracy theory about Mount Weather, continuity of government, and an underground base. No, that's what they have. That's the plan. That's the plan. And that's a good thing. They need to have a plan like this. They need to know, we need to know that, we can withstand something like a nuclear attack or something, but again, you got questionable, nefarious people who use this as an attempt to grab power for themselves. But I just thought it'd be interesting here if we would look at Site R. Site R, which is there's an underground a bunker at Camp David and at Offutt Air Force Base in Mount Weather. But here at Site R, some pictures of I believe Site R is where the representatives, they wouldn't take everybody to the same place. They would be spread out all over the country. So that's what the congressman is talking about here. You can see that there was no need for this to be even considered at that time. But the fact that they were considering this as a possibility, and in fact beginning the process of shifting power over to this new military-led system, is very interesting. Why would they be doing that so early? You can see in this document here where it talks about executive powers. Let's see, there it is. In 2012, President Obama issued 2 executive orders that will greatly expand the presidential powers in the event of a national emergency. That's unnecessary. That's unnecessary. I forgot I didn't bring my other documents in here today to share more about this. It's executive powers here, but the years over the decades, how this was brought into to be, where a person well placed in the National Security Council can actually take over the federal government, they've issued executive orders since the 60s to make this possible. And we get this also with the creation of FEMA. On April 1st, 1979, President Carter established a Federal Emergency Management Agency. It has 2 functions, civil defense and emergency management. And the agencies, in other words, when a national emergency is declared, now FEMA can take over just about everything. They have... it says the Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Amendments of 1988 amended the Disaster Relief Act of 1974, established the previous act established the current statutory framework for disaster response and recovery through presidential disaster declarations. Right. But following the attacks of 9/11, President George W. Bush signed the Homeland Security Act. That created the Department of Homeland Security. But what it also did was that it united FEMA with 21 other federal organizations under the newly created U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Over the next 2 decades, Congress passed a series of legislation following significant disaster events that further shaped the agency. And some of those were the Katrina Emergency Managed Reform Act, was passed in 2006, Hurricane Sandy Reform Act of 2012, and the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. We'll also share more information about this in an upcoming show as well. All right, so now at the 6-minute mark here, the congressman is going to give us some more about what he saw and what he experienced. And I'm telling you, I've listened to this whole interview. He was fighting for us. He was fighting for the people of Kentucky, at least.
Larry Kudlow was one of them. And he said, well, it's not really a $2 trillion bill. You're underselling it. It's a $6 trillion bill. We're going to give $400 billion to the Federal Reserve, and they can loan that out at a 10-to-1 ratio and inject another $4 trillion of liquidity into the economy, and it'll be really $6 trillion. And when I realized that the Republicans were bragging that this was $6 trillion, not really $2 trillion, don't undersell it, I thought, we are in trouble.
Yes. Now he's talking about the CARES Act, or the Don't Care Act. That was the single large. Remember, we all got our stimulus checks. It was a $2 billion relief bill passed, and at the time, everybody said, "Okay, I guess we got to have this." Right? Well, that was, looking back on it now, that was the single largest one-time transfer of wealth from the middle and lower classes up to the ruling class ever. The single largest one-time transfer of wealth in history. Congress was told to stay home. That's what the congressman here reveals. They weren't just told to stay home. The context was it's dangerous, right? You're going to spread the disease. We'll have a super spreader event if we come here to vote on this thing. So just stay home. We don't need to vote on it. Well, the single largest one-time transfer of wealth ever. Yeah, we needed them there to talk about this. But as he said, it was a $6 trillion bill, right? It was $2 trillion in the first bill, but then $4 to $5 billion more was spent. Do you realize that because of that, for generations, we're going to be dealing with inflation at a level of about 30%. That is how you conquer a nation from within. Right? They tried to keep all the representatives away from Washington in order to use emergency powers to enact laws and to pass bills without a quorum. Now, in the Constitution, a quorum is required to do business in any body, a board that directs any kind of company or business. You're required to have a quorum. That means if you've got 12 board members, you got to have a certain number before the meeting is official. Maybe you got to have 8 or 9, whatever your bylaws require. Well, the United States government, the Congress is no different. But they didn't have a quorum. In fact, they didn't have anything close to a quorum. In fact, they were told to stay home. Don't worry about it. We need to just pass these. We need to pass these bills because, safety, right? It's about safety. Here at the 34:30 mark, I encourage you to check this out. Maybe someone will drop this into the description below as well. And
okay.
People can watch this interview. It's 43 minutes. It's worth your time. You learn a lot here. Listen to this quote, or this little bit right here.
At the time, but New York Times reported on it about a month later. I mean, they already had a blueprint out before Trump had been persuaded. So,
and I don't know if we're going to get, I want to make sure we don't forget about this when we're laying down what's happened here, because this is one of the most important things. If you go look at the Fed's balance sheet in March, they did a couple things. One, the balance sheet like tripled overnight, somewhere in that period. And they say part of that's due to they redefined certain terms, like, you know, on the money supply. They show the money supply also went up enormously, and they said, well, that's because we changed.
I think it was in May. Am I right about that?
No, well, you may be right, but here's the main
balance
point.
sheet anyway. It was already expanding before the bill was passed.
Yeah, but here's I don't know when the definition changed, but here's what happened. There wasn't $6 trillion to borrow over the last 2 years. You know, there's borrowing authority, but then there's also who's going to loan you that money. And we've up until that point, we had accumulated $24 trillion of debt, primarily by borrowing from other countries, by borrowing from corporations, by selling treasuries to individuals, right, who wanted a safe investment. And so we had accumulated $24 trillion. But when you go out to borrow another $2 trillion, it's not sitting around. People don't have it to loan to you. So what happened, and what has happened again, and it is happening over the last 2 years, is the Federal Reserve created roughly $6 trillion out of thin air.
Right, according to M2 anyway, right.
Yeah, and according to their balance sheet. They had a fairly large balance sheet with some bad debt and stuff they had accumulated, but nothing compared to the 5 or 6 trillion that they've added to it. Mm-hmm. So I've got a debt clock here in my office.
So that the point there is, again, folks, that taking over a country from the inside, this is how you do it. When the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air, that makes the money that you're holding worth a little less. When they create, at this point, I guess they created something like $4 billion out of thin air. They just printed the money. That's how nations fall. And we all it should have been obvious to everyone. Suddenly the federal government is being more generous than anyone had ever seen. People were paid not to work. As the representative says here, Thomas Massey says, the stimulus checks were the cheese in the trap. That was there to keep us pacified while they took over our government. All right, let's look at this little clip here, 41-minute mark. As it finishes up, here's some inspiring words to agree with here.
Congress and my Republican colleagues...
this is the part where he talks about they told him not to come. It's too dangerous to vote, right? You can't come vote on this bill because it's too dangerous to vote. But then, this was Republicans saying this, not realizing that they were setting the precedent for the coming presidential election the following November, where no one would have to show up to vote, where they were setting the precedent for the future anyway, where people could just vote. You don't know who they are. Let's listen to what the congressman says here.
In particular, we're arguing that it was too dangerous to vote in person in March. And then they turned around and by November, all 50 states implemented methods and procedures for our constituents to vote remotely. For the first time, we had a remote election, but Congress was setting the prototype for it on March 27th. This was a chess move.
Amazing.
And I'll be honest, on March 27th, I didn't recognize it, but very quickly, within a couple weeks, I realized they were setting the precedent for remote voting in all 50 states by arguing if it's too dangerous for members of Congress who have paid government health care, security guards, very good ventilation wherever they meet, if it's too dangerous for them to show up and vote, how could you then later argue that American people have to show up and vote? So anybody who's upset about election fraud or how the elections were carried out or these drop boxes or the mailing in, your Republican members of Congress were arguing that it was too dangerous for them to vote, and then they set the precedent for everyone.
So, folks, that's when we say over and over here, you cannot pledge your allegiance to a party. This is bipartisan, right? What the tyranny, the takeover that we see coming now from the Biden administration and whoever else is running that administration it's been done by the Republicans as well. You can't pledge your allegiance to the red or the blue, right? There's a third way, and that's the truth, and that's to stand firm in Christ. That's your only hope. That is your only hope through this. And I appreciate what the Congressman says right here on his way out.
Brilliant, or God knows. I don't know. But well, anyway, thank you, Congressman, for helping us. You're guiding us through these early days, which are so important. I'm very happy that you were able to set that record straight, and I hope we visit again very soon.
Thank you for documenting this for history, and I hope you etch this into a gold CD-ROM and can put it in a copper container that can't be corroded and save it in a time capsule, because the history is going to, the winners write history, right?
That's right.
And they're going to try and rewrite history. They already are. They're changing definitions. They're setting up a ministry of truth. They're doing all this so that they can establish history. And God bless you for trying to establish the real history with the facts of what happened.
So that's what we try to do. That's what we must do. Tell the truth. Now, as we begin our second half of our show with you today, let's take a brief trip through history. The only way to look at this whole issue is to go through a timeline of events and see how things happened. And it's going to require more than this show. Our first show in this series is Armor of Truth Live number 251. 252 was our discussion with James Roguski about what you can do right now to stop the World Health Organization and that pandemic treaty. Right? You have to keep this in mind about the World Health Organization and the United Nations. You can't just pull out. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Let me not get too far ahead of myself here. Now, in 1946, right, or let's just say after World War II, what the United States saw was a population boom. Soldiers came home from the war in many nations. And so from 1946 to 1964, we saw what's known as the Great Baby Boom. And so from 1957 to 1990, the population doubled. Now, as predicted. The question is that a good thing or a bad thing? And so that's just to set the context. Why were these people, why was the Club of Rome, why were they writing papers about limits to growth and how we're going to, this predicament they say they were in of population growth? Right, we in that period of time, right after World War II, we've got clean water, we've got better health care. We have certainly progressed. It's become possible for humanity to live longer. Do you realize, that 100 years ago, the death rate in childbirth was extremely high. It was around 50%, maybe higher. That's terrible. We don't see anything like that today. But we have different problems. We have much different problems. And so we think about some of the goals of all of this agenda, this plan that we see before us, like Agenda 21, right, that was started in earnest in 1972. Their goal is to reduce the size of the population. They feel it's their duty. They believe they need to rescue the earth. They need to rescue the earth from white men and capitalism. They say that a lot too. But what is our response? Our response must be to reduce the size of government. That's the population that needs to be reduced. It's government. And what must be rescued is common sense. So we ask a couple questions. Whether the aim of the ruling class at the moment, what are they actually looking for in this population reduction? Evil is a fundamentally destructive force, right? It cannot create anything. Nothing in it is truly novel, nor of any use to humanity. Evil's pleasures are short-lived and spurious. Evil is unsustainable. Isn't that funny that the movement for sustainable development is evil at its core? Evil's unsustainable. And the movement is for sustainability. Sustaining what? Sustaining them. Evil is self-defeating, and evil is ultimately leads to self-destruction. We understand that they're evil because they believe in taking supreme authority, autonomy, to take the place of God, just like the Babylonites. They derive their power from fear-mongering and terrorism upon the population. But the terrorism here we're talking about is defined as the operationalized use of fear, pain, and other injury towards socio-political aims. Now, the aim of the Great Reset that we see before us today is to, that conspiracy theory is not real. Great Reset. The idea is to transition the ruling plutocratic plutocracy, that's thieves. That's people who just take power. The plutocratic oligarchy. And oligarchy is ruling by wealth as your power. To transition that into a technocratic rule. The basis of plutocracy is finance, and the introduction of artificial intelligence and automation eliminates the basis for finance as the foundation of an economical scale. So it's a new paradigm that they're trying to create. A new paradigm must be introduced. And so the power group are actually undermining themselves with this significant and sudden population reduction. So the question we have to ask is, are they doing this population reduction? Is it for a new type of slavery? What do they intend, right? Is it to get rid of people? What do they want? What is the outcome? Do they want to enslave people totally? Or do they want to reduce the population to a certain level and then the people who are left have some new utopia? Well, we know this. The core of their movement is evil. So the outcome is not going to be good if they were to succeed. And I just want, if any of this bothers some of you and it worries you a little, it makes you anxious, don't be. Because they will not win. And I'm not just talking about the second coming of Christ. I'm talking about the fact that they can't win. They can't win. They're going to succeed in a lot of things. But they won't get what they're going for. They might, in their failure to get what they're going for, they might by default create something worse. In 1968, the Club of Rome was founded by Aurelio Pecchiai, an international group of renowned scientists, economists, and policymakers to address Earth's sustainability issues and to shape policies. That's the important part. That's really what they're doing, is shaping policies and actions that promote sustainable and prosperous future for humanity. So in 1972, the Club of Rome produces its most influential work called The Limits to Growth, a study conducted by a team of researchers at MIT that claimed to examine the consequences of exponential population growth, resource depletion, and environmental degradation. Again, dialectical materialism at work here. The report sparked global debates on sustainability, economic growth, and the balance between human activities and the planet's finite resources. Aurelio Pecchiai also wrote a report titled The Chasm Ahead, where he determined the following things. And the reason that this is important to share with you is because what he has determined has become, not just him, but the people advising him, these dialectical materialists, these evolutionary Darwinists, Darwinian evolutionists, how do we say that? This is how policy was decided. Right? In the chasm ahead, Pecchiai, he has quite a few things to say. He says, at first, we've now reached a point where we can contemplate no path other than systematic population planning under the aegis of moral and scientific authorities and directed possibly by an appropriate international organization. Right? In other words, the civilized nations, all of these quotes are between pages 172 and 175 of The Chasm Ahead. Civilized nations must achieve some measure of birth control. And what he means specifically there is birth control on developing nations, on poorer nations. That is certainly what the focus was at the beginning of the depopulation policy. Otherwise, he says, drastic measures are inevitable. He's writing this in 1968. And they took his word for all of this. So should we not now be seeing some of these drastic measures? If this kind of attitude and these findings were what shaped policy, shouldn't we be seeing some of these drastic measures? I think we do. I think we see them around us right now. In any case, what seems indispensable to start with is a generalized recognition of facts and their cold logic, Aurelio says. Mr. Pecchii says, on the basis of which all or most peoples must unite and declare that humanity is going to face unprecedented calamity and that everything will get out of control if it cannot reasonably control its numbers. What was the command from the Lord?
Be fruitful and multiply.
Yes, exactly. Be fruitful and multiply. No time did the Lord say, be fruitful and multiply, but be careful you don't multiply too much. Pecchii goes on to say this, a world population plan is pressing, and that one day it will come. He says we must achieve this population control in a civilized manner. We can do it by persuasion, by education, by the diffusion of contraceptives, through the responsible decision of the parents and self-rules of restraint. Okay, so there are some moral claims, right? It's better that we do this. It's good that we do this. It's for the greater good that we do this. So you have to, what is his ultimate standard he's coming from? Well, it's not the Bible. He has no regard for the Lord. And that tells us that his worldview and everything he presents in it is going to be extremely flawed and probably dangerous.
Yes, so I wanted to bring up the work that Jennifer Bielick has done and what we've learned about transgender law and how that has been in action officially from a legal standpoint, rewriting the language since 1993, where they are creating a third sex, if you will, so outside of male, female. And we know that they want this transhuman version of humanity, right? They want to transcend their human bodies. They want to merge with machine. So this is also part of, the guide Reproduction Wisely, because they want to control reproduction literally. They want to take reproduction away from women. They want to grow the babies themselves and determine which babies live and which babies don't.
Right. That's one side of the depopulation agenda, is to control births. The other part of the depopulation agenda is mass murder. Remember, there's two elements to the depopulation. Right? There's contraception, and then there's mass murder.
Well, there's also suicide pods.
And there you go. There's part of the mass murder. So Pecchii said that, biology, nature would decide. If we didn't do it, nature would decide, right? It would see it to it that human incontinence will be remedied through some new germ or virus, right? And what that does, if population is greatly reduced because of some new germ or virus, that takes the blame off of the ruling class and puts it on to the people, right? Because they're dirty, they're unwashed, they're diseased. Again, it could be prophylactics, it could be preventing women from getting pregnant, or it could be mass sterilization. We see that. That's been going on in Africa and India for decades. I've got a video to show you in just a moment for that. He also says there are things like clean methods, biochemistry, abortion, clean methods. He reports also in an essay by Professor J.D. Bernal called Enormity or Logic and Hypocrisy and the Ultimate Solution from 1967. It says this, quote, "There is no limit to human folly and callousness, in the sense that all will end as the only compassionate and rational solution left, with the elimination of all surplus humans, who will of course belong to the poor of the world." Now that is extremely prescient, because that's exactly what the U.S. government's official policy on depopulation stated. Or that's what it did. The focus on depopulation beginning in 1973 was on poorer nations, developing nations. We'll tell you why in a minute. Why did they choose those nations, and why would they choose to do that? Let's see, where are we in our? Yeah, here's a clip. This is a clip from Fall of the Cabal. I've heard a lot about that lately. So here's a little clip from that that was useful. One of the parts out that's useful, where they talk a little bit about Henry Kissinger. This is just well-known information on Kissinger, but this will set us up for where we're going to take you for the rest of the show. Where did all this come from? Is it really part of United States foreign policy? Now we know that it's here on us now. Our own people are trying to kill us off. But let's listen to the origins of it. About 3 minutes here.
Henry Kissinger, world famous as U.S. Secretary of State and National Security Advisor under Nixon and Ford.
Please remember, National Security Advisor. He was on the National Security Council for many presidents, as was Zbigniew Brzezinski. These are men who were placed in that position within the executive branch of the government, where they had influence and perhaps even set policy without the president knowing. That's what happened in Iran-Contra. That's why that is so important.
By some hailed as a hero, by others maligned as a war criminal. Kissinger wrote a top-secret report in 1973 called National Security Study Memorandum, or NSSM 200, also called the Kissinger Report. It talks about the planet's resources, all right. Henry Kissinger came up with a marvelous plan to consolidate the smooth flow of valuable resources from various countries across the world to the US. According to Kissinger, taking other countries' resources was easy as long as countries were stable. Unstable countries were difficult to access. So the question he posed was, how do we stabilize less developed countries? Because for some reason, the planet's most valuable resources, such as oil, natural gas, gold and minerals, were all in less developed countries. In his infamous report, he wrote, "Wherever a lessening of population pressures through reduced birth rates can increase the prospects for such stability, population policy becomes relevant to resource supplies and to the economic interest of the United States."
Translation to that is, it became official U.S. policy that if some developing nation, some poor nation, did not adopt these policies, did not do something to limit, did not accept the gifts we gave them to sterilize their women or their whole populations, if they didn't go along with it, they would get no more aid from Western nations. And in fact, what that would mean, it's a process, right? This, if you know anything about the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, that book, I forgot his name.
I forgot it too. But I made a post about it this week.
So what he told us in that book was how nations get control of other nations. And this has been policy, U.S. policy for a long time as well. What you do is you get the people in that nation to be dependent on you. And all you need to achieve that.
John Perkins,
Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and a newer, updated version called The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Very important. Basically what he's saying, and what we've seen happen, is that we get control of these nations by getting the person we want installed as their president or their leader or whatever. And this is usually because that nation has natural resources that we're going to take. So the way you take over that nation is through loans, through the International Monetary Fund,
yes,
the IMF, Bank of International Settlements, but specifically the IMF is associated more closely with the United States. So by giving the nation loans that they'll never pay back, right? We're going to build you. They never get the money. If we tell a developing nation that we're going to support them with all this money so they can grow, they never get the money. The money goes to contractors who go there to build infrastructure for them. And basically, they can never pay the loans off. And when it comes time to pay the piper, well, they just say, well, okay, you just commit all your oil to us, commit all your gold to us, and we'll continue. We'll keep you in power. We won't. We'll make you look good so that your people don't revolt on you. See how you can just get control. Now, one of those policies was to remove aid from those nations if they did not play along in mass sterilization.
Fancy words to say that in order to create stability, one needs population policy. What does that mean? Legalizing abortion, giving families money if they use contraception, if they accept sterilization and/or abortion. And if that isn't sufficient, population policy means forced birth control, forced sterilization, and forced abortions. Furthermore, Kissinger advised withholding aid, disaster aid, and food aid if a less developed country refused to implement the US population control programs. That was the way to pillage a country of its resources, create stability by reducing the population, and, most importantly, by getting rid of the anti-imperialist youth, the youngsters who tend to ask critical questions. They had to disappear. The result? A massacre worldwide, documented thoroughly in various excellent and courageous research papers that, for some reason, were ignored by the mainstream media and by the UN itself.
And so there is a background on that, because what we share with you now is the Kissinger report. Let me make sure I get the right
and it's funny too, because recently Kissinger went to China and they're sort of, holding him up on a pedestal like he's this great beacon of, peace. And so, just making, of course, well-deserved that the Biden administration looks bad, of course. I mean, that's a given, but that's also by design. And then here's Kissinger, and they have, he has mutual, China and Kissinger both have mutual interests at heart. And so he's coming in to sort of smooth things over and possibly bring about this element of a more peaceful U.S.-China relations. Yeah. So anyway, just how they're putting him in this spotlight of he's doing something positive for the relations with the West.
Yeah, same thing with Zbigniew Brzezinski for years. They present these men as paragons of
100 years old
of morality. Yeah. So what we see in basically here, without it would take me several hours to go through the entire report, but forced abortions, coercive sterilizations, surgical procedures that limit fertility, drugs, treatments, and vaccines that are presented for to keep people from getting some disease, but they're really there for sterilization purposes. And one of the more insidious parts of this is the report states that primary emphasis on population moderation. See, it would require a concerted major effort of focus, organization. And we would have to focus on specific countries. The report states that a primary emphasis on population moderation should be applied to the largest and fastest growing developing countries where there is special U.S. political and strategic interest. In other words, are there American businesses there? Right, that's American interest. Do they have strategic interest to us militarily, or do they have natural resources that we need? In 1974, the named countries, this is what was interesting to find in this, where they had a list of countries that they were going to focus depopulation on. They were India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, Mexico, Indonesia, Brazil, the Philippines, Thailand, Egypt, Turkey, Ethiopia, and Colombia. That's 1974. That's grown, no doubt. What's interesting is none of these countries listed are predominantly Caucasian, are they? Interesting. Remember where the depopulation movement comes from. It comes from eugenicists. The UNFPA, this is the United Nations Fund for Population Awareness, I think it is, ran programs described by critics as forced abortions, coercive sterilizations, but they described their purpose a little differently. They say, quote, our purpose is to deliver a world in which every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's potential is fulfilled. And we do that by limiting the amount of them. Every young person's potential being fulfilled applies only to young people who are actually born. The UNFPA gave money from the United States to support the People's Republic of China's birth control campaign. So when we hear politicians criticizing China for their birth control campaign, limiting births, well, let's be real. Let's be honest about it. Even more than that, we've got other examples of where in India, the report states, which was exposed in 2014, where dozens of women died in sterilization camps to which they were lured to in exchange for social benefits. The program also received funds from other governments and various organizations, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, again, these come from National Security Council, right? In SSM 200, that is National Security something memorandum. They've changed names, but specifically what I mean, it's a communication within the Security Council. And then it becomes a national security directive. Then it becomes something that we want the president to make an executive order to make this thing official policy. This is circumventing the procedure, circumventing the Congress. It's illegal. The United States relies on countries being underdeveloped in order to easily obtain natural resources. American businesses are vulnerable to interference from growing populations, and high birth rates result in more young individuals who oppose established governments. Right? These are the reasons they stated for their depopulation policy. So from NSSM 200 and National Security Decision 314, the National Security Council recommended that worldwide support for population reduction should be sought through, quote, increased emphasis on mass media and other population education and motivation programs by the UN, USIA, and USAID. The policies adopted from these National Security Council decisions expanded even further in 1976 after the National Security Council advocated for the use of withholding food as a strategy of influence and using military force to prevent population growth. Do you remember at the top of the show when we showed you the article about 270 million people might starve? They're in positions to starve. They've become dependent on a source for their sustenance, and that source cuts it off, and these people are starving now. And we see in these documents that that was the plan all along. A December 1974 memo from the National Security Council to President Ford explained. Now, remember, this is just a note from one of his advisors to the president, or to the person that reads those for the president. It might even get to the president. In the Reagan administration, it rarely did get to him. It explained that all U.S. efforts should be undertaken in such a way as to minimize criticism So we have to say it's for the greater good. We have to make up a cover story. We need to stress the development of well-being and economic progress of the poorest countries, right? We're only here to help. We're here to help.
Yeah, think
the
about
government. We're here to help.
Think about what's made some headlines about Nigeria, what's happening in Nigeria right now, which has a population of about 220 million, and how they're trying to roll out the CBDC and the digital ID onto that population. So what it looks like is a test market to roll out this new system that they ultimately want to bring to all nations.
Yeah, it's a good example. We'll look at this video now. Let me share this a little bit with you here too. And as of August 1974, the CIA prepared a document called OPR 401. The world's increasing dependence on American surpluses portends an increase in U.S. power and influence. The implications for the world food situation and for U.S. interests would be considerably greater if climatologists who believe in a cooling trend is underway to prove to be right. So this is back when climate change they were afraid that there was going to be a great ice. They weren't afraid of it. They were saying it. They were saying that was going to happen. So that's another one of the failed predictions from the globalists, from the United Nations. So the CIA there is saying, look, if the climatologists would just agree that climate change is happening, this would help us out a great deal. Goes on to say, if the trend continues for several decades, there would almost certainly be an absolute shortage of food. The population problem would have solved itself. Now, pay attention in this video we're going to show you here now about, the people don't even realize they've been hit. They've been convinced that the things they're doing are good for them. But pay attention for these 10 ways to, top 10 methods that they're using to reduce human population. Targeted sterilization, for one, of course. Right? That's eugenics, right? To improve the human population. Wars are another way. Also, no cures for diseases, right? Think of this. Today's doctors are drug dealers for the large and powerful pharmaceutical companies. So human doctors might be replaced by artificial intelligence soon. Doctors remain powerless against big pharma, government regulatory bodies such as the FDA. Any doctor who tries to be a real doctor and actually cures people is discredited out of his profession. So you take away real doctors because the artificial intelligence will just give the remedies that you make available to it. But no cures for diseases also means that no cures, only treatments. That is the Western pharmaceutical, the Western medical system there. Allopathic medicine, where we just treat, but we don't cure.
Well, what's really troubling is what's happening very dramatically in Canada right now, where they're taking strong measures and moves to get rid of natural health. Like natural vitamins and such, and they're putting fines on it, and they're literally trying to shut down anybody who wants to do any kind of natural healing, natural alternative
because
medicine.
It's dangerous. I mean, don't you know that it's dangerous to take those?
Yeah, it's for the greater good.
Those vitamins. I mean, your government hasn't checked those vitamins out yet.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's make it clear. There is a place. Regulation can be a good thing. It can make things better.
Yeah, but we know that that's not what's going on.
We've got big problems here, right? We've got people, when your worldview is completely flawed, when your worldview has evil at its core, you can't expect that what they're going to produce is going to be good. All right, so another method to check for here is sexually transmitted diseases. Right? Remember the Tuskegee experiment right here in the United States of America. You can tell a group of people that here we're going to give you this medicine that's going to prevent you from having this disease, and it could have some kind of transmittable disease in it. That happened in the United States of America. It's happened to other places. Well, it says here, sexually transmitted diseases reduce human reproduction. They shorten lifespan while creating a drug-dependent patient. In other words, a lifetime customer. The main goal of STDs, it says in the documents, is to discourage pregnancies and create self-inflicted population control, which is a lot more efficient than forced population control. Another method is environmental manipulation. Pesticides, chemical agents in the air, on the crops, things that cause cancers, asthma, allergies, and other sickness, right? If you live in a nation like ours where the pharmaceutical industry is one of the most powerful lobbies that there is, and they're going to profit from your chronic illnesses, you can bet they're going to try to make sure you have chronic illnesses. The main goal of, it says, meanwhile, weather manipulation also by DARPA and other agencies around the world directly result in disasters that appear natural, but kill thousands at a time. The truth about climate catastrophes is that over the last 100 years, deaths as a result of some kind of climate catastrophe, some kind of hurricane or heat wave or whatever, have decreased over 90%. That's a fact. It's not getting worse. It's getting better. But of course, when you're able to control the weather in a region, you can have these outcomes. Okay, another thing to look for here is abortions, the encouragement of abortions. Abortions is the result of a perfectly executed population reduction campaign that resulted in self-execution. According to the World Health Organization, there are 40 to 50 million abortions per year worldwide, or about 125,000 sacrifices every day. Why do you think the demonic is so strong in our world right now? It's because Molech is being honored on about a minute-by-minute basis. Okay, another reason is the encouragement of homosexuality or same-sex relationships. The explosion of same-sex images in the media and Hollywood and movie content is a planned and executed psychological operation, or PSYOP. The PSYOP conducted over the last 10 years on the human population has accomplished its mission of creating self-executing population reduction paradigm. Same-sex relationships promise to be the most efficient human population reduction tool that ever existed. So when you see the rainbow flags flying and the people demanding their rights to be gay, they have completely been enveloped in a program. I'm not saying that they don't actually feel that way. We're sure that probably many do. But as we see this transgender movement growing now, and where trans kids are exalted as this, how did you say it a moment ago, as this third
it's the third sex.
Yeah, it's just a new kind of human being now, they say. And
there's even been in the headlines, like certain countries refuse to acknowledge the third sex. I think that was Russia.
Yeah.
They're actually, whatever, but they're totally, Russia's on board with the SDGs and
of
everything.
Course, that means that Vladimir Putin is going against his original or his personal convictions.
Right.
It means he has to. That means that means he knows he has to do it.
Well, publicly he's saying he's not supporting the third sex, but ultimately he's doing business with China and the WEF, so that means nothing then.
All right, so another method to control the population, things that you'll see in this video, are food supply. That's self-explanatory. But also transhumanism. Now, this is one of the most important ones we have today, and that would include transgenderism too. So transhumanism, the merging of humans with sophisticated technologies to enhance, the hope is for them, to enhance intellectual, physical, and psychological capabilities. Transhumanism you won't find transhumanism in this video because this is from 1974, but just so you know, transhumanism would completely eliminate the need for human population control or reduction, since the technological enhancements would allow the creators and administrators of transhumans to literally control their body and mind. All right, so let's take a look at this, starting right here. here.
She looks like she has bat wings.
That's quite a dress.
I couldn't help myself.
Now, please remember here that this report is going to be it's taking a look at this program as though it's a good thing, right? This is from the National Library of Medicine. The video is called Population, Challenge and Response, USAID 1974. A broad overview of the problem of overpopulation and the attempts underway in several countries to meet the challenge of curbing population growth. This came out in 1974, right on the heels of depopulation being a United States official policy.
Though we usually think of the problem of an exploding population in terms such as economic development, overcrowding, underemployment, ecology, education, maternal health, and personal freedom, it has come down for these people on this day to a matter of life and death.
Children dying from starvation in underdeveloped countries and children dying in the wars. There is no much difference. They are both murdered. I'm scared about the population in the whole world, but especially in El Salvador, which is the place where I live, where my children are, my wife, my work, everything. And I'm scared, of course. That's why I'm working here.
Is it desperate? Do you think it's desperate?
Yes. I think it's desperate, the situation, but somebody has to do something. We have to do something. And when I say something, I am complaining because I want a very strong and aggressive policy in population. If this country is going to be a country, a livable country within 20 years.
El Salvador has the highest population density in Latin America and one of the highest population growth rates in the world.
All right, we'll skip ahead here so we don't take too much time. You get the idea. Let's go to the 6-minute mark here. Again, listen for the acceptance of these procedures, the acceptance of the fact that your problem is overpopulation. They've been told that. Is that true? In most cases, no. The problem is that they've been co-opted, and the standard of living has been decreased through manipulation, pilfering, and pillaging of their nation from outside.
It can be operated with local anesthesia and then go home in 4 hours.
Dr. Madrigal got his laparoscope from the Pathfinder Fund, an American foundation concerned with population in developing countries. Along with Pathfinder and other groups, the Agency for International Development, AID, the largest source of assistance and funding in the field, is helping in an international assault upon the most pressing problem of the 20th century.
Okay.
Tiene razón. Y esta familia.
All right, we'll skip the Spanish up to the 9-minute mark here. A fabulous dress here, son.
The subsistence level, and with the present growth rate of 3.1 of Philippine population.
Remember, the command from the Lord was to be fruitful and multiply. Now, it is surely reasonable for us to assume that where paganism prevails, all kinds of problems are gonna result. But let's listen.
You can just imagine how disastrous this would be for the future of our social and economic development.
As a Peace Corps volunteer here in the Philippines.
Oh, that was Imelda Marcos. I believe that was Imelda Marcos. She was.
Philippines, you see many different developmental projects, and there are projects in agriculture, education, infrastructure, and yet all of these projects are diminished because of the vast population problem in this country. So I feel as a volunteer.
Right, said the Western activist, your problem is population. Now, I'm sure it looks like that. It seems that way.
Working here, it's been very rewarding to be in this kind of program that's at the crux of the matter.
What you hear, for the Lord up above.
Children, too, are at the crux of the matter. In a class on population awareness in an elementary school in Cabanatuan City, second-grade students play a game. How many of them can fit into a limited space before the overcrowding becomes unbearable? How How far can they be pressed before the game suddenly becomes unfunny?
Pay attention here to the mind control. Is there any reason to do this for education? No, this is indoctrination into see, this would be an example. I guess I need to be more clear here. These are all examples of policies put onto these people by American foreign policy, or, as you'll hear in a bit, the World Health Organization, which was a lot of American influence in its founding.
God created man and all the beings in this earth, and by nature we're all selfish as God has created us. And it is one of the things that God has given us in order that we should be able to survive. So every man by nature is selfish. And in our family planning program, we are exploiting the selfishness of man in order that we can push through our family planning program. Why? Because we know very well that over and above the laws of God, the laws of society, is the law of the stomach, which is one of the expressions of selfishness of man, the law of the stomach. So if you go to the barrios and tell the people there in the barrios about, oh, you can help the world, your country, by embracing family planning, they would not listen to you. But you tell them, you help, if you embrace this family planning program, you'll be helping your children, in order that they will not be undernourished, in order that they will be able to go to school, so that you can give them a higher degree of education. It will be a very effective way, much more effective, and that is what we are learning.
Okay, so the lady you saw was Imelda Marcos, and this is her husband. The Marcos, they ruled in the Philippines, and were very much controlled by the American government, right? So that's why you hear the leader parroting American depopulation policy. Right, he talks about the law of God and how people. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I have a really good friend who lives in the Philippines, and he was saying that they were extremely strict during all of the lockdowns and everything.
Oh yeah, that was one of the
hardcore,
worst.
One of the most hardcore enforcers of the rules and mandates. Yeah.
All right, so jump ahead here to 13. So that's interesting where you heard Marcos there talking about the law of God. We're all created in the image of God, and so that he's taking advantage of the fallen nature of humanity in order to push this. He's completely forgotten about be fruitful and multiply. Right. Then that's because he was committed to American foreign policy, because he wanted to keep his position, of course. All right. Next.
Though the government has no official population policy, the Family Planning Association of Liberia, a private group supported by the International Planned Parenthood Federation, supplies family planning services for those who wish them.
There's your Planned Parenthood, your first mention of Planned Parenthood. This is Liberia.
Emphasizes the health and welfare of mothers and babies, and instructs women on the proper spacing of children.
Just pay attention to how positive it all sounds. The music is upbeat. This is all for your good, right? This is eugenics at work. Jump ahead to the 15:10 mark. On to India now. Now this is where it's going to get very dark.
After mainland China, the most populous country on earth, over 500 million people. If the growth rate is not checked, there will be more than 1 billion people by the year 2000. The effort here has been enormous, the oldest and one of the largest official family planning programs in the world. 20 years of labor by hundreds of thousands of people. The goal? Lower the birth rate by 40% over the next 10 years. Wow. In India, they use the cafeteria approach, making a wide range of birth prevention methods easily available. Sterilization, intrauterine devices, condoms, and other conventional contraceptives, including pills in selected projects. However, sterilization is the mainstay of the program. In the city of Kannur in Kerala State, one of the great innovations of the Indian effort, a vasectomy camp, an intensive campaign to perform more than 15,000 operations in 30 days.
All right, so we've got a vasectomy camp. Remember what we just shared with you earlier was that one of the reports was that in India, there was a sterilization camp for women where many of the women died as a result. But what the point here is that why did these men come here? Did they come here out of a sense of patriotism and duty, right, to receive a vasectomy, to get their tubes tied? No, in fact, many of them came there because they were lured under false pretenses. Just keep that in mind as you listen to this rosy report about vasectomy camps.
This is where all the people come for the vasectomy operation. Here, please go on. See. Now we go to the control room. See, this is the control room where all the activities are controlled. Actually, this is the nerve center of the camp. These are the officers responsible for the camp. District Family Planning Medical Officer, DMO, Mr. Tampi, and Deputy Collector. Here we find all the people lined up for the operation. You see, they are coming from all over the district, and not only from this district, from other places also. His name is Shankaran. He is 38 years old. He says he has 3 children. His wife is 30 years old. Why do you come here? Operation. He says he doesn't want any more children. He has 3 already. He says his wife is willing, and he has no objection. Not that his wife have any objection for the operation.
The operation takes less than 10 minutes and can be performed with scarcely the loss of a single drop of blood. At one camp in Gujarat state, doctors performed the incredible number of 223,000 vasectomies in 60 days.
That's 250,000 people sterilized in 2 months' time.
There's a carnival atmosphere at the massive camps. Programs of live entertainment, songs and dances about the need for family planning, prizes, inducements, awards. One feels here that a whole people is behind this effort, that Indians regard family planning as a patriotic duty.
Right? You see how what they've been told is patriotic duty, and we'll give you a nice show. I guess this is the equivalent of a burlesque show for the Indian. All right, let's see here. The next one. Next example.
Tunisian family planning officials meet with representatives of foreign agencies concerned with population. A doctor from the United Nations World Health Organization, a nurse midwife from the Swedish International Development Authority, a demographer from the Population Council, representatives of AID, and doctors, communicators, and demographers from other groups. There are meetings such as this in all the countries committed to population action. The challenge is worldwide.
Children dying from population action. You like that? It's called population action. Not eugenics, not population control, not sterilization. It's population action.
Such as this in all the countries committed to population action. The challenge is worldwide. The response is international. Standing in the courtyard of the great mosque of Kairouan, Imam Muhammad Ali Trad says that family planning is not contrary to...
Listen to the indoctrination on this man. I don't know. He may or may not be an actual imam. He may or may not be. He's not faithful to his religion because his Muslim faith would certainly not agree with this kind of planning. Wouldn't agree with abortion or sterilization at all. But listen to the way he thinks now that he's been run through the propaganda mill.
Islam, and it is necessary for the economic development of the Tunisian nation. Religious leaders throughout the world are conscious of the population problem, and many of them have found that the idea of family planning is consistent with their religious principles.
That means that there is a new religion in town, right? There is a new religion in the world, and it is a totalitarian religion that sees the state. It sees all government authority as supreme. It is God. The state is God.
The role of women in Arab society is changing. Many have rejected their traditional role and now practice family planning. Dr. Ben Sheikh, a leader in the struggle for women's rights and the first female doctor in Tunisia, devotes all of her time to family planning counseling and clinical work.
Note the language. You know, she's fighting for women's rights. Women's rights. When you say that, well, that's a good thing, right? Women's rights. No. But you can see that this is this is a complete propaganda piece.
In Tunisia, as in many other countries, the postpartum approach has been extremely successful. Immediately following the delivery of a child, women are especially responsive to a visit by a family planning worker, providing information on contraceptive methods. But it is not enough to confine the work to clinics or to wait for people to appear. Family planning workers must visit remote areas, bringing in...
There you go. Right, it's not enough. It's not enough. We've got to take this right out into the most outlying areas. We've got to get everybody. This is an evangelistic effort.
Information and services and a special kind of human understanding.
Special.
The key to all family planning programs is the winning of acceptance. Will the women who are contacted accept the methods that are available? The approach is the same everywhere. In Tunisia, in South Korea, in every country in the world, one woman must talk to another. She must be sympathetic and friendly.
You have to lie to them. That's what they're saying.
The home visit in a rural area is like a ritual. The lonely walk, greeting, the establishment of rapport, the opening of a briefcase, the display and explanation of available devices. The women who do this work are a new breed of missionaries, and they often speak of their...
You see that lady? I don't think that lady was... I don't think she was favorable. What's this reaction?
The women who do this work are a new breed of missionaries, and they often speak of their reward, the sense of personal accomplishment when they win another woman over, when they achieve the breakthrough called acceptance. South Korea, more than 32 million people, a rapidly developing nation that has reduced its growth rate by 1/3 in 10 years. The goal for 1976, another 1/4 decrease.
All right, and if they go along with it, they get aid, they get money, they get status with the United States, and they remain enslaved to whatever they've come to enjoy, to believe that is good. All right, here's the
well, not just the U.S., but with the UN.
Yeah, I do. I'm picking on the U.S. because that's we're talking about here that it became official U.S. policy in 1973. But no doubt about it, you've heard the other. Well, it's a Western thing, right? It's the U.K., the U.S., Canada's involved.
Globalists.
Yeah.
Young.
Since 1965, the United States, through the Agency for International Development, has provided rapidly increasing support for population and family planning programs throughout the developing world. These funds, channeled through many organizations, now especially the United Nations, have gone for a broad scope of action, including research and the provision of contraceptives, such as these, especially oral contraceptives, provided so that poor women and couples in the developing countries can control their fertility as they wish to improve their health and well-being.
Yeah, to control their reproduction as they wish. Today we hear it's called reproductive rights. Right? You have the right to be sterilized. You have the right to be controlled. It's sad because there's so much deception. There's just so much deception.
It's like the Respect for Marriage Act.
Right. Yeah. We're in a war for language. The language is one of the main weapons. It's been weaponized. One of the first media examples that we see about this specific thing here is Associated Press. How about that Freudian slip? The Associated Press.
Speaking of which.
The Associated Press reported on a 2009 New York meeting of billionaires. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, David Rockefeller, Eli Broad, George Soros, Ted Turner, Oprah, Michael Bloomberg, and others. This was a big deal. I remember this in 2009. I remember talking this when I was working. I used to work night shift with a bunch of guys, and this came up like this meeting of the billionaires, and they're planning, what they're planning. The Times of London headlined it, "Billionaire Club in bid to curb world population." Quote, taking their cue from Gates, they agreed that overpopulation was a priority. The article said, adding that this could result in a challenge to some third world politicians who believe contraception and female education weaken traditional values. Well, in the new religion, you're faithful if you go along with sterilization. Gates, Buffett, Turner have been quietly worrying about Malthusian population problems for years. Mr. Gates, in February 2009, outlined a plan to try to cap the world's population at 8.3 billion people, consistent with the Kissinger report from 1973. So you see, it's not Bill Gates' operation. He's just a major player in it. Of course, his father was a devout eugenicist. In 2010, a former staffer with the Government Health Initiative in Ghana made a shocking claim. The Gates Foundation had tested the contraceptive Depo-Provera on unsuspecting villagers in the remote region of Navarongo as part of an illicit population experiment. The woman making the charge was the Ghanaian-born, U.S.-educated communications officer for another Gates-funded initiative. The Depo-Provera story caused a national scandal. The Navarongo project hadn't tested any medications, so many death threats were directed at the project that some staff had to be evacuated. Across the Burkina Faso
Frog
border.
in your throat.
Okay, so the episode would mark the opening shot in a new war over birth control in Africa. It also reflected an evolution in the United States anti-abortion movement strategy in which it started to co-opt the language of women's and civil rights used by progressives. There were fewer bloody fetus posters and more talk about how abortion and contraception violated women's safety and impeded racial justice. So the counter-argument. Anti-abortion groups hired black activists and highlighted uglier aspects of the industry of reproductive health care. In particular, the courting of the eugenics movement by Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger in the early part of the 20th century. We've covered that plenty here. So, a right-wing documentary called To Block Genocide in the 21st Century America used a Swahili word that refers to the Holocaust of African enslavement to denounce Planned Parenthood as racist. Billboards in Atlanta and Manhattan carried messages like, "The most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb." And federal and state legislators proposed a series of bills banning race and sex-selective abortions in order to insinuate that abortion providers deliberately target communities of color. And as we've seen, the evidence clearly suggests that they do. In other countries, that's the foreign policy. It's also now domestic policy. All right. So do Black Lives really matter? Is the question. So let's see. There's a lot of this. I'll save some more of these reports for our other shows on this. So now we want to talk about, we're going to get to Barack Obama and the Paris Climate Accord, how he circumvented the government to get that and what that means for this argument. But how does this get done? What is the backbone of hidden government, right? That's our title today. I'd do well to get around to that subject, wouldn't I? What is the backbone of hidden government? Well, we've given you a pretty good idea of what that is so far. Most Americans are unaware of national security decision directives. This is an article from 1989, a column written by Eve Pell in The National, or The Nation, publication called The Nation, from 1989. During his 8 years in office, Ronald Reagan issued approximately 300 of these national security decision directives. Again, this is within the executive branch. These are directives that lead to executive orders, things that become law and become official policy without the checks and balances of the other two branches. Central Intelligence Agency started arming and training Contra soldiers. It was found in these, that millions of dollars had been allotted for that. It allowed for the car bombing in Beirut that killed 80 civilians in an ill-fated attempt to assassinate Muslim fundamentalist leaders. A national security decision directive authorized the U.S. invasion of Grenada. Right? Congress had nothing to say about it. And another national security decision directive forced millions of U.S. government employees and contractors to sign non-disclosure agreements or secrecy agreements to classify all of this. But national security decision directives are different than executive orders. Unlike executive orders, which are listed in the Federal Register or presidential findings, which are made known to the House and the Senate, intelligence committees, NSDDs do not have to be revealed to any other branch of government. Moreover, the degree of secrecy is staggering. Of the directives issued by President Reagan, fewer than 50 have ever been declassified. Right? That's out of 300. The National Security Act of 1947, written at the outset of the Cold War, grants implicit authority to presidents to issue papers on national security. The right to issue policy directives has always been assumed to be one of the inherent powers of the presidency. Over the years, these directives have evolved from broad statements to specific decrees that, according to the recent General Accounting Office report, can establish national policy, can authorize the commitment of federal resources. So a national security directive, not even an executive order, can set policy and can obligate federal resources to be used for this and that, for whatever they seem. In the case of Iran-Contra, it was to run a secret war. In the case of Barack Obama, it was to tie up the United States in the Paris Climate Accords, which we'll talk about in a minute. And these directives continue in force from one administration to the next. They don't expire. So it's like, this is literally secret government. This is literally a shadow government. And it's right inside the White House. What do you think is happening right now in the White House? You've got this president who doesn't even seem to be aware, doesn't even seem to be coherent most of the time. Do you think they're having a field day right now? Do you think we'll ever recover from what they're doing right now that the Congress doesn't even know about? NSSDs cover such topics as nuclear weapons deployment, Central America, Star Wars, classified information, arms sales, civil defense, food aid, summit meetings, and the Iran-Iraq War. Remember, this article is from 1989, so it's a little dated. The most powerful part of the story remains hidden, buried in more than 200 NSDDs, whose very subject matter is still concealed. You can bet it's only gotten worse. And that the COVID response was a field day for this. Is there a plan to avoid the Constitution of the United States? Have these directives made that possible. Our old military bases being considered as detention camps for political dissidents and undocumented aliens, bring that on up in our time. Are old military bases or new facilities being built to house the unvaccinated or people that go on YouTube and talk like this. Either national security directives have gone by different names. Earlier directives, they go by different names. Sometimes they change what they're called, but their power is no less extraordinary. President John F. Kennedy's National Security Action Memorandum 31 set in motion the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. That's why it was a controversy. The Congress didn't know about it. President Johnson's NSAM, that's what he called it, National Security something Memorandum, 273, widened the war in Southeast Asia by authorizing military incursions 50 kilometers into Laos. So going against what Congress had established. President Truman's NSC 68, issued in 1950 and kept secret for 25 years, opened the gates for breaches of law in the name of national security. So our own executive branch breaking the law in the name of national security, we can find that origin back in the 1950s. It recommended, one of these Truman documents recommended operations by covert means in the fields of economic warfare and political and psychological warfare with a view to fomenting unrest and revolt in selected strategic satellite countries. Folks, that's not a conspiracy theory. That's U.S. policy. Illegal U.S. policy. I just make it clear. I love America. I'm grateful to God to be born here. And because I love it, this kind of stuff has to be exposed. It has to be shown. People have to know that there are elements in our government that are ruining it. Anyway. Okay, some more of this. Some of Ronald Reagan's NSDDs are action documents bypassing even normal agency channels, let alone Congress. Right? Some of them not only bypass Congress, but they bypass the procedure that's been established in the executive branch itself. The arrogance of this arrangement is incredible. NSDDs appear to have been the backbone of hidden government. Ostensibly, they are merely internal memorandums from the president to the officers of his administration or vice versa. Some of them seem to be no more than that. The declassified NSDDs on preparations for summit meetings, for example. More often, though, these NSDDs appear to have been issued to evade congressional scrutiny, to evade public debate. Worse, they've ordered actions contrary to the government's stated policies. And on occasion, they have infringed on basic American liberties. Again, this is 1989. How much worse is it now? John Poindexter issued an order implementing NSDD 145 intended to limit access to what the government labeled sensitive but unclassified information. So that's just another way to say we can decide what we want to declassify. We can decide whether it should be or not. We can do whatever we want to do. Because they never defined what sensitive but unclassified even meant. Konstantin Menzies was part of Ronald Reagan's National Security Council. He left the CIA to work for the National Security Council from 1981 to 1983. He wrote a book called Inside the National Security Council, which I'm reading right now, and it's revealing quite a bit. After other high-level discussions, Oliver North and Konstantin Menzies drafted an NSDD ordering the invasion. On October 23rd, the day of the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, Reagan signed the NSDD and the military moved into action, all without consulting Congress. So why did the bombing in Beirut happen? One of these directives ordered it. And while that happened, another one was Another one was created that moved the military, that mobilized the U.S. military without consulting Congress. Some began from the mid-level of the bureaucracy as national security study directives. That's the NSSD, the Kissinger Report, in other words, is one of those. It's really supposed to be there it's designed to analyze policy options and to advise the president. But then they worked their way through the NSC's maze of groups, subgroups, and restricted groups where they were rewritten and eventually arrived at the Oval Office as the consensus reached by the president's advisors, whether it was or wasn't. Others, according to the report, stemmed from ad hoc discussions between the president and his advisors, after which a snap decision was made. NSDDs reflect an ominous shift in the traditional locus of federal decision-making. You have players from state and defense and justice all sitting around cutting deals, says Scott Armstrong of the National Security Archive. The National Security Council, the bureaucratic apogee of interagency decision-making, coordinates the agencies. And since the NSC director is not subject to oversight, means no one's keeping a check on him, the process circumvents Congress completely. That is why it's so important to understand who Paul Friedrichs is, the new director of the Office of Pandemic Preparedness, because that office sits in the executive branch under the umbrella of the National Security Council, which means they can do whatever they want to do. National security directives are secret laws. Now, there is no such thing as a secret law, right? Once it becomes a policy, it's there, but that's the idea. NSDDs are sometimes the only record of a secret policy. The secret policy of the United States, one of the reporters asked, is the secret policy of the United States the same as the public policy of the United States? What we find out is no. They are misused by overzealous presidents and National Security Council members. For example, in the Reagan White House, the council had a pronounced proclivity for using national security directives, apparently because it didn't have to make them public. Congress has known about some controversial NSDDs and ignored them. That's where we get to Barack Obama. Next. Many have gone into effect without the required presidential signature even. Many were released without the White House letterhead at the top of the page and without the president's signature. And many had been signed by AutoPen, not by Reagan's on hand. That's a device that puts the president's signature on something using an actual pen. But anyway, so this has become de facto legislation, a vehicle to make policy and law from within the national security state. On February 2nd, 1989, George Bush issued National Security Directive 1, officially renaming the president's secret laws National Security Directives. Right. Now what we've done is we've established how it's possible for our governments to do things that we all know are not constitutional. And when it becomes official policy. The problem is when the Congress knows about it but does nothing about it. Now back to our timeline. In the 1980s, we had the Iran-Contra affair. Let's listen to, I've got a clip here, just to give more evidence and examples of what was, this is from the 80s. This is on a YouTube channel called Alternative Views, which is, you can learn an awful lot. So this is sometime in the 80s. It's sometime after the Iran-Contra. It could be in the early 90s, but listen to what these men are saying.
What you have is a potential for an authoritarian response to a crisis that could end up in the end of democracy as we know it in the United States.
The inherent power of the President of the United States to suspend the Constitution or any provisions thereof or any laws of the government when he decides it's in the national interest to do so.
Giuffrida, North, and George Bush began to turn FEMA into an instrument of domestic anti-terrorism.
You're dealing with a group of people in the Reagan administration who equated political dissent with treason and who cannot differentiate between emergency procedures, which I think everyone agrees are necessary, and suppressing political dissent. And with North and Poindexter and Casey, you had a group of people who saw Americans who disagree with them as the enemy.
I was particularly concerned, Mr. Chairman, because I read in Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed by that same agency, a contingency plan in the event of emergency that would suspend the American Constitution, and I was deeply concerned about it.
We look at the many laws which adversely affect our constitutional rights, particularly the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. A lot of these things you don't know about, but we'll tell you right now on Alternative Views.
Yes, and on Armor of Truth as well. So this is an example of a shadow government, right? Ruled by decree. The Iran-Contra affair, for those of you who don't know. It was a political scandal in the United States during the second term of Ronald Reagan. Consisted of 2 covert operations run out of the National Security Council by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Senior officials secretly facilitated the sale of arms to Iran, then engaged in the Iran-Iraq War, which is publicly labeled as state-sponsored terrorism, but we're involved with them, to generate, and also the purpose was to generate untraceable funds. So to break all that down, basically what was happening out of the National Security Council is they created this shadow government was running a war. As Daniel Inouye said, they had their own funding, they had their own navy. And basically what they were doing was laundering money through drug dealers and gun runners. The crack epidemic in South Central Los Angeles got its start from this kind of operation. If I'm not mistaken, from this operation, where cocaine was brought back. You know, you take the guns to the Contras. Do they always pay you cash? A lot of times they paid them back in cocaine that was taken into, that was flown back. This is the story of Barry Seal. They even made a movie out of it. This is not hidden any longer, where huge amounts of cocaine were taken into South Central Los Angeles, and you had guys like Freeway Ricky Ross, who the CIA worked directly with to establish this mechanism for bringing in huge amounts of money. Right, so you create to give these drug dealers an option to be rich, and all of them ended up in prison eventually. Ricky Ross is just one of them. Google that name sometime, see what you find. Now I forgot, boy, I keep forgetting my names now. There's another man that I should be able to tell you about right now. Who was a police officer in Los Angeles. Somebody in the chat will know. Who exposed all of this, and he exposed it to the face of the CIA director at a public hearing. Anyway, Iran-Contra. Contra is a word that's short for contra-revolutionaries or counter-revolutionaries. They were a brutal rebel force in Nicaragua. This is who our government was supporting. A brutal rebel force in Nicaragua known for human rights violations and atrocities. Who they were fighting was the Sandinistas. This was the government that was installed there. The Sandinistas were communists who were aligned with the Soviet Union. So, they figured if we're doing this, that was the whole argument in the Iran-Contra hearing, was that we thought this was the right thing to do because those guys are communists. What they were doing, though, is all of the things we've mentioned. It's completely evil. Congress had already banned sending aid to the Contras, so this shadow government inside the White House did it anyway. Operations were discovered and publicly exposed in November of 1986. 14 Reagan administration officials were indicted. Well, law and order prevails, right? 11 of them were even convicted. However, most of the convictions were vacated on appeal in 1991 when George H.W. Bush became president. After Ronald Reagan, he pardoned them. This is how it works, folks. The National Security Council played a significant role in the Iran-Contra affair as the hub from which covert operations were run out of the White House. Why this is important is, how do you think the COVID response was run? And I mean even when Donald Trump is sitting in the White House. And now that, and then as soon as Joe Biden came in, it was just free-for-all. There was no resistance to it. The president's advisors, the NSC, most notably Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, were exposed for all to see as it was publicly revealed that White House insiders could give orders. They could issue executive orders themselves and use the name of the president and operate a secret or shadow government right from the White House. Shockingly, this is perhaps one of the most common abuses of power in the executive branch of the federal government today, right now, because it's become commonplace to ignore the separation of powers. It's become common to just go around constitutional checks, just to ignore the constitutional checks and balances on power, to run covert operations and activities from inside the executive branch. That is a severe breach of separation of powers. That might even be treason. Now, as we go to Summer's favorite character of all time, Barack Obama and the Paris Climate Accord, or treaty. So what's interesting here, let me just give you a background on what is the Paris Climate Accord. It's also known as the Paris Climate Agreement. Adopted in 2015, it is an international treaty aimed at combating climate change, of course. But it's way more than that. It is generally politically binding. Let's just lay out right here. What's the difference between an accord and a treaty, right? We hear the term pandemic treaty. Well, it's not going to be a treaty. It's going to be an accord. Go ahead.
The Constitution requires that the Senate vote on all treaties, and there's a high bar. It takes a 2/3 vote to approve. Which is why Barack Obama decided, they got together and decided to change the name of the Paris Treaty to Accord or Agreement. So what is this? Let's just lay it out here. A treaty is an agreement that is legally binding. An accord is an agreement that is politically binding. All right. Now, hopefully we'll be able to help you understand what that means for the World Health Organization pandemic treaty, and we'll use this Paris Agreement as an example. So when we're talking about an accord, enforcement is not through law, it's by regulations or public pressure. A treaty is legally binding. In other words, there must be consequences for failure to abide by the terms. It must be legal consequences. It's not that way when it comes to these climate laws, climate policies. The goals of the Paris Climate Agreement are to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. In other words, they want to take the average temperature on the planet back to pre-industrial levels. The only way to do that is to tear down all of our infrastructure. In other words, to make everyone on planet Earth suffer. That's what they want. The Paris Agreement doesn't set specific requirements for individual countries, like the U.S., for example. What it does is it allows each country to determine its own nationally determined contributions. That's an official term. That's called an NDC, nationally determined contributions. In other words, what the agreement says is, here are our standards. We have to do this. You have to get the global temperature to down 2 degrees on average, and
this much carbon is allowed and this much. So they have standards, targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, basically. The requirements are countries that are part of the agreement must set their own targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions according to the standards that the Accord has set, right? For example, the U.S. is expected to set ambitious NDCs and to take actions to mitigate climate change. So the agreement promotes, they say, transparency, accountability, and regular reporting on progress towards these goals. So the Paris Climate Agreement is not a treaty because it's not legally binding, but it is legally binding in the sense that countries are obligated to, number one, communicate their NDCs, communicate their goals, what they're going to do. They're required to make efforts to achieve them, and they're required to regularly report on their progress. The agreement does not outline specific penalties or consequences for failing to meet stated goals. This is a concept we've been reading and researching here this summer. Found in her research something called reflexive law, which we'll be describing that a little more as we move on, as we get to a point where it's more appropriate. Something called reflexive law. It's different than the rule of law.
Yeah, if I could, I just want to have a paragraph about it, that builds on what you just said. Reflexive law is primarily procedural law and therefore may be considered self-regulation.
Yeah, that's the big point, is self-regulation.
Yeah, and think about the social credit system.
It sounds good, right? Oh, good, I can just regulate myself.
Right, so instead of directly regulating behavior to reach predetermined outcomes, reflexive law attempts to influence decision-making and communication processes with required procedures. And reflexive law has turned rule of law over on its head. And we're going to get into that, as Brad said, as we go along.
Yeah. Hey, let me think. Takarisha, I hope I said your name. Takarisha Skiles helped me out. Yes, it is Michael Rupert. Michael Rupert was the former L.A. police officer who blew the lid on the cocaine, the CIA bringing cocaine into South Central L.A. and creating this huge crack epidemic. Okay, and Michael Rupert, his early on when he came out, he did so much important stuff there. He got attacked quite a bit by the establishment too, and over the years he sort of drifted away from his purpose. And he was ultimately he either committed suicide or was suicided. Nobody knows, but he was found in his. He was living in a trailer in Colorado, I believe it was. Anyway, so what Summer has just described as reflexive law now. In the Paris Agreement, the way they enforce these is the agreement relies on transparency and international pressure to encourage countries to fulfill their commitments. In other words, what reflexive law, administrative law, this kind of policy making does. This is what the United Nations does. This is what the World Health Organization, this would be the foundation of their framework convention.
Yeah, so they're definitely using it to implement sustainable development goals, for example.
Yeah, by peer pressure, diplomatic relations, and of course public opinion, right? So what if they can make you look bad because you're not doing your part, they will do it. But really it's regulation. If you're a company and you're not going along, why did Bud Light all of a sudden decide?
Yeah, you get a score.
Yeah, why did
you get a score?
This is essentially ESG scores and social credit scores, things like that. That is an example of reflexive law. The rule of law says we establish a law, and that's the law. And when you break it, here are the consequences. But reflexive law is different.
It's always moving too. It's like a moving target.
Moving target, yeah. So, like Bud Light, why would they essentially shoot themselves?
Yeah, shoot themselves in the foot.
Why would they do that?
This is why.
It's because they realized that if they didn't, the penalties, I don't know. It still doesn't make any sense to me why. Were the penalties going to be worse than $4 billion loss? I don't know. But this is why these companies are doing this. Now, here's the timeline of the Paris Climate Agreement. This will help us understand what we're experiencing. In June 2017, President Trump announced the country's intention to withdraw. Now, I'll tell you more about this in a minute because Barack Obama put us into this agreement. Let me go. I guess I need to do that first.
It's a lot of information.
Yeah. Here's an article from the New York Times in 2017, July. They report that in 2014, the New York Times broke a major news story. Obama pushing climate accord instead of treaty. It's a clumsy headline. No one was claiming that the Kyoto protocols, the Paris Climate Accord came up out of the Kyoto Protocol. And no one was saying that it was anything other than a treaty requiring Senate ratification. Everybody knew from the start, oh, this will have to go through the Senate. But what the story revealed, what the New York Times report revealed was shocking news, which was made even more shocking by an email that was revealed by the State Department in Freedom of Information Act litigation. Remind you now, too, that Summer has given on armoroftruth.net. Summer has an article there about how to use the Freedom of Information Act. We can all do it.
Yeah, I can drop that in the chat as well right now.
Do that.
And it's also posted in the YouTube community post for Armor of Truth.
All right. So what that email revealed was the Senate's failure to confront President Obama on his usurpation of the Congress's constitutional treaty function through the Paris Climate Agreement. The New York Times story's key passage said, quote, in seeking to go around Congress to push his international climate change agenda, Mr. Obama is echoing his domestic climate strategy. In June, he bypassed 2014. He bypassed Congress and used his executive authority to order a far-reaching regulation forcing American coal-fired power plants to curb their carbon emissions. The president is abusing his executive authority by pushing through major policies without congressional approval, unquote. Now, Obama jammed those EPA rules through by executive fiat. Now, when you hear somebody say that, executive fiat, now we know how they do it. National security directives. Sometimes it's executive orders. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes they just make policy. They go around the procedure. After a Democrat-led Congress killed legislation to grant the authority, he then claimed to already possess that authority. He just made up the laws as he went. The Supreme Court put the rules on ice. So the Supreme Court found out about it and ruled against it, stopped it. But the Paris Climate Agreement, however, unilaterally opposed on Mr. Obama's way, was imposed, sorry. So what Obama did was on his way out, in his last term as president, and literally on his
he just chucked it in there.
Right, on his last days in the office, he unilaterally imposed the Paris Climate Agreement on the United States. Something that would be, the Paris Climate Agreement was a treaty that was going to last until the end of the century, the article reports. Now, our Constitution's Article 2, Section 2, says that no president can commit the United States to treaties without Senate advice and consent. So how did Barack Obama get around that? Anybody want to raise your hands out there? How did Barack Obama get around our Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, that says he cannot involve us in treaties?
Reflexive law.
Without the Senate, right. It's not a treaty. It's an accord. It's an agreement, right? So that's what we're dealing with here. A disturbing contempt for the Senate's constitutional rights and responsibilities. Yet the Senate, rather shamefully, made no move to stop this contemptuous usurpation. The Paris Agreement is the successor to the Kyoto Pact that died in the Senate. So the Senate had already decided it didn't want to be a part of this plan because they had already killed it. Such treaties are non-starters under the United States democratic process. Paris, even more so. This is what we have to understand about the pandemic treaty. Right? There will be no vote. We've already joined the treaty. When we joined the World Health Organization, whatever they decided to do, we're already in agreement. Well, the only way...
Exit the WHO.
Right. This is what you got to know. Withdrawing from the Paris Treaty requires a 2-year process. Isn't that interesting? Because it's the same thing with the United Nations.
It's the same thing for the pandemic treaty.
And it's the same thing with the World Health Organization. There's a 2-year process. Now, here's the interesting part about the Paris Agreement, Obama and Trump, that help us understand. The U.S.'s withdrawal from the Paris Treaty officially happened on November 4th, 2020. Trump said he was going to do it, but it couldn't happen immediately. The sad thing is he waited too late because it takes 2 years. But they did accept our withdrawal the day after the presidential election, the day after Trump had already lost. And then 127 days later, on February 19th, 2021, Joe Biden himself reversed Trump's decision, right, inside the White House, inside the executive office, and recommitted the United States to the Paris Agreement as a full participant.
Well, you know, they've always got to make it look like the politician is working for you. So yeah. I'm skeptical whether that was really a move by Trump to liberate us from that. But
he did wait too late, right? He had to know that.
Obviously wasn't a priority.
No. Now, withdrawal from these pandemic treaties or these accords is withdrawal from the treaty that's not how we do that's not going to matter. That's not how to think about this. If you're going to contact your congressman or your senator, it's not about withdrawing from the treaty. We're already a part of the treaty.
Yeah, that's with the IHR amendments as well, because we're already signed on to those already for decades. So.
Right. Just like the U.S. is a member of the United Nations, the only way out of these dystopian designs of this particular globalist climate tyranny is for the United States to permanently withdraw its membership from the United Nations, from the World Health Organization, from the Paris Agreement. So now, again, the same applies to the World Health Organization pandemic treaty. Just so you know, we keep saying it over and over.
But you know, the 2 years is how much, I mean, that's how long, like, so say we withdrew, well, then we would still be accountable to whatever they want for 2 years. So think about all the damage that they could do for 2 years. So really.
The fact is, yeah, you can, when you withdraw from the World Health Organization, you're still obligated to fund it until you've formally been withdrawn, which is a 2-year process. Same applies to the pandemic treaty. The United States must withdraw from and cut all ties to the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and all of its sub-agencies. That's the only way out. It's the only way out of this. So that hopefully helps you. This Paris Climate Agreement helps us to understand how these executive orders
how this happens. Exactly, it does. Mm-hmm.
Brazenly, Team Obama advanced a historic pretense of declaring what even they held as the most ambitious climate change agreement in history. Somehow, not a treaty, betting they did this, Obama and his people, they did this, betting that the Senate would not speak up. And they bet right. Betting that the Senate wouldn't call them on their breaking of the law. They're ignoring the Constitution. I don't think they bet right. I think they owned people in that.
Well, and part of the story about the backbone of how this all got started was that like politicians could not understand science and technology. So
that's one of the that's a huge problem we have here, because people don't understand. It's good to see that there are some congressmen and senators now that do understand that there is no climate crisis. There's no such thing. There is a crisis of government tyranny is what we have. So the reach of the Paris Agreement wasn't really known when the New York Times article came out. In fact, that would be a permanent situation. The seizure of power that it revealed made big news, shocking Senate lawyers, which makes you wonder why aren't there more stories about the pandemic treaty right now? We're running out of time. The lack of Senate intervention to this day remains a scandal. Remember, same thing was happening during the Iran-Contra. Same thing's happening right now. Republicans and Democrats all letting these things slide. We heard from the congressman earlier. Even the Republican congressmen were going along with it. The institution has so atrophied that it can no longer muster the will to protect its constitutionally delegated prerogatives. On June 1st, President Trump announced he would withdraw the United States from the Paris Treaty. That's 2017, June 1st, 2017. But through a process requiring him to wait more than 2 years to send written notice, this would take effect 1 year after that, by chance, the day after the 2020 re-election. As a purely executive move, Mr. Trump's successor can just restore Obama's treaty with a pen and a phone call, unless the Senate weighs in. And as we told you, 127 days after the election, Biden did just that, put us right back into it. We all deserve to see and consider what Team Obama's discussion was. In other words, there's a whole thread of emails about this where they're talking about what they're going to do, and it's been found. Heavily redacted emails showing the state officials exchanging emails or having been caught so far in advance of their intended coup. They were rightly worried, yet in the end, the Senate did nothing. So it's not unusual at all for factions within our own government to try to orchestrate a coup. A book called War is a Racket. Got it. Oh. Got it right here behind me. Let me look at this because is it here? Yes. Yeah, here we go. By General Smedley Butler. Here you go. Describes just this same thing happening years ago, where a group that included about 150,000 members of government and other people, they came to General Smedley Butler and they said, we're going to do this thing. We're going to run this coup. We're going to take over the government, and we want you to be our figurehead, because he was a war hero. Well, he didn't immediately say no. He wasn't going to do it, but he let them hang themselves by giving him a lot of information, and he exposed them for it. But it's not new. This is not new. So we've got to be aware. We've got to know how to talk about these things. Back to our timeline. In 2019, on October 18th, something called Event 201 occurred, a simulation of a global pandemic to assess readiness and response strategies. It was held in New York City at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security in partnership with the World Economic Forum, a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and on and on. So that's 2019, October. We get to November 2019. Suddenly, there's a documented case of a novel coronavirus. So you can see here, this is the website for the Event 201. A lot of people like to say, well, that's just a big conspiracy theory. Right here, if you see the lady on the left of the screen, you can see on her card there, that's Avril Haines. Who's she sitting beside? George Gao, China CDC. Do you see that? She's sitting right beside him at Event 201. This lady was already on the National Security Council at this time. Under the Biden administration, she became the head, the director of national intelligence. Is that right? In other words, she sits now at really the apex of the intelligence community in Washington. And there she is, sitting at the table at Event 201. Again, another small piece of evidence that the COVID response could have very well been something orchestrated by intelligence, the intelligence community. All right, so now we move to 2020. On January 7th, the novel coronavirus was identified by Chinese authorities. January 11th, China reports its first death. January 20th, first case in the United States is reported. And then by the end of January, on January 30th, the World Health Organization declares a public health emergency. It wasn't such a big deal then, but if the pandemic treaty, if nobody, let's say, it's not that if it goes through, it's if you don't withdraw from the World Health Organization now, when they declare a public health emergency again, it's going to mean that there's going to be a contact person for the international health regulations in your country, and that person will be in charge. How? Through FEMA, through all of these things we've already described to you. We'll try to maybe do that in another show, explain how it's set up to where someone who's not the president, not even an American, can take control of this country. They've already established the means for it. February 11th. Let's see, I think I had the... I was going to play a clip of the highlights of the Event 201. I'll just
It began in healthy-looking pigs, months, perhaps years ago. A new coronavirus spread.
So this is the simulation that they planned. This is, again, October of 2019. One of the first videos we did here on this channel was about this, and it got immediately taken down by YouTube.
Spread silently within herds. Gradually, farmers started getting sick. Infected people got a respiratory illness with symptoms ranging from mild flu-like signs to severe pneumonia.
So instead of bats in China, it was pigs in South America.
The sickest required intensive care. Many died. Experts agree, unless it is quickly controlled, it could lead to a severe pandemic, an outbreak that circles the globe and affects people everywhere.
The mission of the Pandemic Emergency Board is to provide recommendations to deal with the major global challenges arising in response to an unfolding pandemic. The board is comprised of highly experienced leaders from business, public health, and civil society.
We could be looking at double the number of cases in 1 week and 16 times as many in a month if we are not able to stop the spread. That would be on the order of 500,000 cases, and it would continue to rise exponentially. In 3 months, we could be approaching 10 million cases.
We're at the start of what's looking like it will be a severe pandemic. And there are problems emerging that can only be solved by global business and governments working together.
Direction, and something needs to change.
So the policy question for this board now is, how should financial resources be prioritized? Are there nodes that we cannot allow to fail?
So they go through this process in this so-called simulation. Well, it's a simulation of how you would run lockdowns, how you would, all of it. But what you don't hear in this is anything to do with social distancing or masking. These things all came later as a part of what we're going to show you at some point here soon is the Western intelligence community. These things didn't come from medical experts. They came from intelligence agents. Okay, our timeline. February 11th of 2020, the virus is named SARS-CoV-2, and the disease it causes is named COVID-19. On March 11th, the World Health Organization declares COVID-19 a global pandemic. So they declare a public health emergency, and then they declare a global pandemic. Each one of these ramps up to where they have more and more authority. And as we go into the future here, if this pandemic treaty is finalized, these things will have far-ranging implications for all of our lives. On March 13th, the United States declared a national emergency. All right, so that's where the president declares there's a national emergency, not a health emergency, just a national emergency. So again, under that, they have immense power. They don't have to worry so much about the Constitution anymore. From March to April, many countries imposed travel restrictions, lockdowns, and social distancing measures. On April 24th, they began reporting global deaths, and there was over 200,000, they say. And so on and on about how certain drugs at certain points were either said they were either accepted or disallowed. On July 27th of 2020, Moderna began phase 3 clinical trials for its vaccine, which it's not a vaccine at all. It's
medical countermeasure.
Yeah, it's a medical countermeasure. There's another term I'm looking for. It's gene therapy. Definitely, it's gene therapy.
Well, yeah.
It's not a traditional vaccine at all. It doesn't deserve to have the word vaccine. That's not what it is. But on August 11th, Russia announced the world's first approved COVID-19 vaccine, named Sputnik 5. I don't know if any of you remember that. That was a weird one. On November 9th, 2020, Pfizer and BioNTech announced their product is more than 90% effective. Okay? In November, what is this? 9 months, 8-9 months, and they've got a product. They've got a countermeasure, and it's 90% effective. December 2nd, the UK, first Western country to approve a COVID-19 vaccine. It was the Pfizer-BioNTech version. December 14th of 2020, the first COVID-19 vaccinations in the United States were rolled out. And of course, everyone showed up on TV to get theirs, all kinds of campaigns going. On New Year's Eve of 2020, the World Health Organization grants emergency validation to the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. So these are called pandemic products, and that's going to be one of the major points in the pandemic treaty as to who controls all these products and who gets to profit from them. Of course, it'll be the World Health Organization. Now we move into 2020. Why was 2021? Why was that year what was so different about that year that people just excess deaths shot way up? January 20th of 2021, the United States began a comprehensive COVID-19 response strategy under the new Biden administration. So it's the new response. There you go. Biden unveils his new strategy that Trump resisted, according to New York Times. And of course, you know at this time what the New York Times is reporting about Trump. Everything's going to be negative. Trump resisted this wonderful, policy. February 11th of 2021, World Health Organization approves AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine for emergency use. On March 11th of 2021, the U.S. Congress passes the $2 trillion CARES Act, or the COVID-19 relief package. Remember? The one that they did. Congressmen, don't even come to Washington. It's too dangerous. We're going to take care of it. April 21st of 2001, over 1 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses were administered worldwide. That means they were shots that went in arms by that date. Over 1 billion. May 5th, 2021, the United States supports the waiver of intellectual property protections for COVID-19 vaccines. That's setting the stage for the World Health Organization to take over all of it. Profits and everything. June 10th, the United States, June 10th, 2021, the United States donates 500 million Pfizer-BioNTech doses to lower income countries. Are you listening? Are you paying attention? This show is about American policy, an American policy of depopulation. And we've shown you all kinds of ways they do that. Here's the newest. On June 10th, 2021, the United States donated 500 million Pfizer-BioNTech doses to lower income countries.
Yeah, and Paul Friedrichs, who's heading up the OPPR office, Pandemic Preparedness and Response Office, he is somebody who was boasting in that conversation that he was on the video the other day. He was saying that they've given 1.4 or 1.3 billion just to push policy through and around the world.
Oh, yeah.
Just policy, just
policies.
Yeah.
What kind of policies, right? What kind of well, we've hopefully shown you exactly what kind of policies he's talking about. It's depopulation policies. All right. And not
but
just
it's all for the greater good.
It's for the and definitely there's a lot of they have a lot to gain from it in other ways. July 27th of 2021, the CDC recommends fully vaccinated individuals should wear masks indoors because it works so well, right? Remember they said our shot is 90% effective. Effective at what? Effective at what? Safe and effective for what? Well, it absolutely wasn't safe and effective for stopping the spread of anything. August 23rd, 2021, the FDA grants full approval to Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. That was by years. It broke the record of how long it takes to bring. Let's see, what do I want to call it? It's not a vaccine. To bring a treatment like this to the market, at least 5 years up to this point. But here, all of a sudden, they've got it. They've got full approval in less than a year. September of 2021, the first booster shots were made available, and the COVID-19 vaccine becomes a part of our lives. So this is what I want to communicate right now. We're at war in the United States and globally. Public health emergencies, as we've pointed out here, especially when we don't know where they've come from, have largely the same legal status as war declarations, right? When someone declares a natural emergency. PHE, or public health emergency declarations, effectively suspend the Constitution. They let the executive branch, including the Department of Defense and Department of Health and Human Services, usurp the power and neuter the legislative and judicial branches of the government. We've shown you how. We've shown you examples over the years. Republicans and Democrats both abusing the power. And once they're initiated, there's no stopping their conditions.
And think about what they've done with the IRS and how they've armed the IRS, and then also how they have armed the HHS as well.
We're at war, no doubt. And so the deployment of these biochemical poisons, they're advertised as vaccines, or any other medical countermeasures, they call them, for whether it's for COVID or for any other made-up sort of reason, does not depend on federal or state pharmaceutical regulations, right? It goes around all of that. They're not subject to any consumer or research protections, like informed consent or proper testing, none of that. So that brings up the question, the ethical concerns here. Did they have intent to harm us? That depopulation agenda that was foreign policy of the United States since 1973 is now domestic policy. That intent to harm people out there is now domestic policy. Biochemical poisons are being pushed on a mostly unsuspecting public and even professionals who for some reason don't know any better. And the reason most of them don't is because there's a bait and switch scheme on here where FDA approval was a sham. The role of the Department of Defense is extremely important here. And the fact that Paul Friedrichs is now inside the White House, inside the National Security Council, with an office with very little restrictions. All COVID countermeasures were ordered by the Department of Defense.
Yeah, and think about, I have his credentials up. So he was a second lieutenant, a captain, a major, a lieutenant colonel, a colonel, a general, and a major general, and has stars. So yeah. In addition to having a medical background, but think about the military connection here.
Yeah, he was a surgeon, so he's highly trained. He should know better. He must know better, right? But
and he's special assistant to Biden. Yeah. Like that's his other role as well. Yeah.
The reason that we speak so definitively about this, about the D.O.D. and what they've done is it's because the contracts between the Department of Defense, the contracts that they made with Pfizer and Moderna and whoever else, they've now been released, declassified through Freedom of Information disclosures. Let's see, where is it? There you go. And even though they've been redacted, you can see them now. The contracts include removal of all liability for the manufacturers, right? So Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson, all these companies, one of the first things they wanted in the contractual process was, you're not bringing this back on me. We'll make this for you. You're going to pay us all this money. We're not even going to test it. So if we're not going to test it, we need something in this contract that says the government is going to protect us. The problem is that government protection, it's not going to last. You're not going to remain above the law forever. It'll come back on you. Any contractors, including, it's not just the producers of the vaccines, it's contractors along the supply chain, they're going to be held accountable too. The 2005 PrEP Act was also revealed through Freedom of Information request, and related federal legislation, except in the case of willful misconduct. So, in other words, in case it could be, unless it can be shown that there was willful misconduct by these manufacturers or the supply chain, those on the supply chain, they can't be sued. But this idea of willful misconduct, clearly demonstrable. The implications of what we're telling you here can't be overstated. Senior executive service officials within the U.S. government authorized and funded the deployment of biochemical poisons on Americans and other people, and $500 million out to developing countries, poorer countries, without ever clarifying a prototype, without ever doing what's supposed to be done, which is a large-scale demonstration. That would be a trial. Legal status, making the materials not subject to normal regulatory oversight, all while knowingly and willfully maintaining a fraudulent pseudo-regulatory presentation to the public. In other words, through the news and through the propaganda and through social media, these are completely safe and effective. Don't you understand? You're a conspiracy theorist. You're a wacko right-wing extremist if you don't think so. Really? That's how it worked. That's how propaganda works. And where did that ever come from? The intelligence community. All the evidence points back to there. Hopefully we'll get to that very soon for you. But these countermeasures, these weapons, these bioweapons have harmed and killed and continue to harm and kill Americans and other people around the world. I won't go into detail now. We've talked about it, but it affected directly our family. No, we haven't. Summer and I haven't taken anything from these people and will not. Unless they strap me down, I'm not taking anything they have to offer. But our family has, and we've seen it. At least 3 members of our immediate family have experienced bad things. These countermeasures and the deployment program has been partially coordinated through the Public Health Emergency Medical Countermeasures Enterprise and via several other public-private hybrid quasi-governmental entities, including but not limited to the FDA's Medical Countermeasures Initiative. You heard Friedrichs saying there, we need to give these agencies the authority to go out and procure countermeasures without having to go through all this safety.
Yeah, again, that YouTube channel that we were watching, the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, Friedrichs was talking openly about how the Department of Defense was distributing.
Yeah, it's not a secret. They don't see any reason why it shouldn't be. But now it's been moved right inside the executive office of the White House. So what we're saying here, the totality of the evidence today points to the intentional harm of these injections, as well as all of the other countermeasures. The wearing of masks never came, it didn't initiate from any medical source at all. It came from the intelligence agency, from the intelligence community. All of the memes, all of the ideas came from them. the shots, the lockdowns, suppression of drugs that actually work. Of course, other problems such as depression and drug abuse and alcoholism spiked. And also the overuse of benzodiazepines and opioids in the hospitals during this, hospitals and nursing homes, when they were effectively culling the elderly population in our country. Overuse of ineffective and harmful, but very profitable drugs like remdesivir. And finishing patients off on a ventilator. That was the craziest thing we saw early in 2020 when ventilators were being used. Something that's always been a last resort seemed to be, and it was revealed that when a hospital would use a ventilator, they would get for a COVID-19 diagnosis, they would get like $13,000, and if they put someone on a ventilator, they would get $30,000. These numbers are not exact, but they were benefiting financially from using this. Or just simply starving people to death. Locked in a hospital COVID unit, right? We know, one of our viewers went through that and was telling us about it as she was going. They just left her to, this is Kelly, for those of you who know, it's not a secret. Kelly Henson, she was just left in her hospital room, and described it to her family. She described it to us as she was going through it through text messages. She was scared, and eventually she died from it. And that's not the only case. It's not rare. There's many cases. You can find many reports of this. The mechanisms of injury, right? Was there an intent to harm? There's injury designed into these countermeasures. In layman's terms, it simply trains your cells to attack and destroy themselves. Are we looking at a depopulation agenda through the pandemic response? So, there is no safety nor efficacy in these products. They haven't been tested. They're being tested now, I guess. Instead, we observe a horrific death and injury toll. Negative efficacy is what we see. In other words, a propensity to cause illness has been documented as well. In fact, in other words, it seems that these injections tend to cause the disease that they're said to be preventing. It's completely upside down. Now, we've also got this I wanted to share with you too. DARPA, on the DARPA website. DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, right? These are the science arm of the U.S. government. And DARPA also, their purpose has always been to expand and further technology, to build weapons. But they have a pandemic prevention program as well. And they say on the website here, the P3, the Pandemic Prevention Platform Program, aims to support military readiness and global stability through the pursuit of novel methods to dramatically accelerate discovery, integration, and preclinical testing and manufacture of medical countermeasures against infectious diseases. Where's my countermeasures? Turn. P3 confronts the reality that Department of Defense personnel are not only deployed around the world for routine operations, but are often among the first responders to outbreaks of emerging or re-emerging diseases with pandemic potential. For example, their response to Ebola. P3 aims specifically to develop a scalable, adaptable, rapid response platform capable of producing relevant numbers of doses against any known or previously unknown infectious threat within 60 days of identification of such a threat in order to keep the outbreak from escalating and decrease disruptions to the military and to the homeland. State-of-the-art medical countermeasures often take many months or even years to develop, produce, distribute, and administer. The envisioned P3 platform would cut response time to weeks and stay within the window of relevance for containing an outbreak. Of course, they say nothing there of safety, right? P3 focuses on rapid discovery, characterization, production, testing, and delivery of efficacious DNA and RNA encoding medical countermeasures. There you go, gene therapies. A foundational technology pioneered by DARPA under the Autonomous Diagnostics to Enable Prevention and Therapeutics program, the ADEPT program, that provides the body with instructions on how to immediately begin producing protective antibodies against a given threat. So that's DARPA. And there. Okay.
To be continued.
Yeah, we're on a roll here, so we'll start wrapping this up now, because I didn't intend for this one to go this long. But hey, if you've noticed, our last couple of shows have been more right around an hour, a little less than an hour and a half. And we'd like to make more of those available for you as well. The idea kind of being that maybe on Thursdays and Fridays we would have longer form shows for you, but Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday maybe we can offer more short bursts of information to you. We're looking to find ways to streamline our approach here to make it easier for people to absorb this information without sitting through 3 hours. But sometimes we have to take a deep dive, and what we'll do is we'll be happy to cut out clips from this and make it available on the channel here. And we encourage anyone, you see our content on YouTube, if you know how to download it, or you take it and use it, make your own videos out of it. The only thing that we ask you to do is just send people back to this channel. Tag the channel, tell people, where it came from.
Hit the like button.
Definitely. Please do that. What we're dealing with here with these people, why do they do this? Do they really believe they're doing something good? These are something that we're terming enlightened utilitarians. So that's what they think they are. They think they're enlightened. They think it's their divine purpose. Not their divine purpose. They think it's their moral duty to immanentize the eschaton, to create a utopia here on the planet. That's kind of an esoteric phrase, immanentize the eschaton. It just means they want to create a perfect civilization. Right? But now, why are they doing this? Well, there's something called the noble lie, which we've talked about here before. And what it means is that there is the concept comes from Plato's Republic, a noble lie, where Socrates proposes and claims that if people believe this myth, that it would have a good effect, make people more inclined to care for the state and one another. And it's a fact that does happen. But when you have people like we see in charge today, you have a big problem with that, because their worldview is extremely flawed. Right? They need to create something. They need to deceive you. Enlightened utilitarians aim to deceive you. And they say they're doing it for the common good. Human populations will little by little come to embrace the kinder angels of their nature and usher in a world marked by much less cruelty to both human beings and animals. Who could be against that? The problem lies in their methods. Everything they offer, they speak a lot about happiness and the general good and being rational, a rational thinker. Who decides what is happiness? Who decides what is universal or a general good in society? Is it true that rationality is coterminous with knowing? Or that rationality is the only true path to happiness and moral improvement? How do you define the supreme moral good? Today it's about aliens, right? Aliens are going to come because people believe that aliens possess the ability to generate and spread happiness better than humans do. Some would say that. Now, this is the position of Peter Singer, an evolutionary believer, utilitarian. He admits the possibility that there may not be a common metric for happiness between two such civilizations that are crossing at the moment. And so these groups, as Peter Singer says, this dominant group in the world follows reason in general, offering universal directives, because they say they want to develop a more universal ethic for a wider group of human beings to make the world a better place. Utilitarian principles. They believe that because they're sent to do this for the world, that it's their purpose, it's their noble purpose, that it's right to do and privately recommend, under certain circumstances, what it would not be right to advocate openly. In a sense, they make the moral justification for deception, to deceive people in order to achieve the greater good. The lie is called noble because it's presented as if it serves a valuable civic purpose, but also because the lie must be so massive. It's got to be so big and so pervasive that the average citizen wouldn't ever think to question it. That's COVID. So grand a lie that it would seem to be obviously true. Vaccines are safe and effective, so it's obviously right that we all run out and get it. So bold an invention that the people would just never think to even question it. How could anyone pull off that kind of a lie? It couldn't be true. This noble lie, this towering tale, this monumental myth, this monstrous misrepresentation, it must become fanatically irrefutable so that the fiction becomes fact and that legend becomes law. Because the narrative cannot be questioned. And so the myth becomes the grounding identity for the whole nation and everyone in it. If the people can be made to believe the noble lie, they'll be strongly motivated to do whatever it takes to serve the lie. It usually comes along with some kind of altruistic motivation. In the case of the COVID response, it was, we're going to save lives. At its core, the tactic employs a fictional narrative that's presented as though it were true, typically veiled through some kind of movement for the greater good. The aim of the leaders is to present a case that will compel the masses to unite behind their specific goals without asking why. And so the threat that everyone is fearing must be significant enough that everyone fears it. A greater percentage of the group fears it. The percentage needed to successfully support totalitarian agendas in the past has been surprisingly low. The good news about that is the number required to overthrow a power-drunk dictator is similarly low. We just have to be informed. The justification for their methods is that all developments of human history have been driven by economic issues, as we said at the start of the show today. That those with the means or the power to control the global economy have a moral right to shape the world in the way they choose. This means a transition from capitalism to communitarianism, which means the total elimination of all classes and inequities. The solution to the flaws is to evolve economics and society, to evolve humanity. In the book 2052 by Jorgen Ronders from the Club of Rome, who was also one of the writers on the Limits to Growth paper, they make the case that democracy is too slow. Democratic decision-making is too slow for the severity of the problem we're in. Therefore, top-down solutions are now mandatory. Control must be shifted out of the hands of the many and into the hands of the few as quickly as possible before it's too late. There's no time for debate. Human extinction is imminent. And they may really believe that, because their worldview is broken. It's flawed. They propose solutions to problems that they've created. This approach is doomed to failure and will leave a dystopian result far worse than their original plan. There's a call for unity, but it's a form of unity that can only be achieved by force. The new normal world order has proclaimed its position boldly, that unity must be achieved by brute force, by any means necessary, and everything is on the table, including mass murder and even internment camps for dissenters. The tactics deployed, these new false flag operations, are set up to forcibly take control of the narrative and establish an all-new meta-narrative, a new religion of the global state as God, a new Nebuchadnezzar, a new Babylon, a new tower to escape God's wrath. False saviors as far as the eye can see, all of them pretenders. God's invitation to our generation is the same as it has been for every generation. He says, come with me. Doug Wilson writes in his book, Rules for Reformers, which is supposed to be a response to Rules for Radicals. He says, it's not possible to build a culture around a denial of God-given standards and then arbitrarily reintroduce those standards at your convenience whenever you need a word like evil to describe what just happened. He says cultural unbelief, which leads inexorably to cultural nihilism and despair, is utterly incapable of responding appropriately to things like this while remaining fully capable of creating them. C.S. Lewis said, with his knack for breaking things down so we can all understand them, he says, we remove the organ but demand the functions. We honor depraved men and expect them to be virtuous. We expect them to stand for righteousness. And then we mock honorable men. And then we're shocked to find traitors in our midst. We're shocked to find traitors in our own government. Suppose humanity was actually facing a collapse. A collapse of the climate of the planet, like the scientific elite have proclaimed for the last 60 plus years. Is anybody really persuaded that these current world institutions, the World Health Organization, United Nations, American government, is anybody persuaded that these people are in any way actually capable of handling such an existential crisis? Take a look at the policies and read the Sustainable Development Goals. They're not actually feasible, and they know that. Sustainable development is it's an amorphous concept, always changing to fit the evolving narrative of so-called climate change policies. As some are described earlier very well, reflexive laws are updated and repurposed to keep the ruling class in their position. And then executive orders and secret policy making and fear campaigns achieve the same purpose. Why would they do that? Why might these people push forward plans that they know are not even possible to achieve? It's because we're cursed with a bunch of blind seers who are either diabolically lying through their Klaus Schwabs, or their minds are so completely darkened that they really do think they can solve death and build a tower high enough to avoid the wrath of God that is to come. It's Babylonian buffoonery, and we're all guilty. The message I want to leave you with today is that it's time to stop blaming them. We can't fix anything if we continue to just blame the elite. We have all financed their rebellion, and we've all profited from their piracy. All of our hands are collectively bloody. And it's time to admit it. It's time to own it. It's time to repent. Doug Wilson wrote, he said, quote, "According to Scripture, blood is something that returns to those who shed it. It also returns to the land where it was shed. Not only does the United States sacrifice nearly 1 million new lives a year on the altar of disordered ambition, with our tax dollars and with our silent consent, we also engage in the mass murder with the psychopaths who run the system. America the beautiful. Is it really? How is America kept beautiful? Is it by the apathy of a spoiled and lazy citizenry? Elizabeth Willing Powell, prominent figure in Philadelphia during the Revolutionary War. She was the daughter and wife of 2 former Philadelphia mayors. She lived through the Revolution. She was a brave supporter of the American Revolution. She protested British occupying troops in her city during the war. And she tended to wounded soldiers of the Continental Army, and also hosted and engaged in political discourse with men like George Washington himself. In 1787, after the signing of the Constitution, legend has it that Ben Franklin exited what is now known as Independence Hall. Then it was the Philadelphia State House. He was approached by a group of citizens eager to know the outcome of the convention and what form of government had been created. As the story goes, this woman, Elizabeth Willing Powell, openly debriefed Franklin, shouting, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" And Franklin's reply, as you've heard now, was, "A republic, if you can keep it. That's our duty." Franklin's reply was to this astute lady, and everyone within earshot, was a warning, and it's a call to action. They understood well the challenges and responsibilities inherent to the citizens of a democratic republic, maintaining the liberty that was earned in blood and enshrined in the Constitution of the United States. That requires the active participation and vigilance of the people, of you. Freedom is not free. Democracy is fragile. Without the ongoing commitment from you, from me, from citizens, to preserve the institutions of the Republic, to hold all its leaders accountable, and to protect the values of freedom, justice, and equality, the success and survival of a free society is doomed. Our complacency, our apathy, our silence, our silent consent to the atrocities of our own government are just the tip of the iceberg of our national sin. Let's not be so mesmerized by the prestige of our birthright as Americans that we fail to see our involvement in our own national judgment. Luke 18, verses 11 through 14, we see the story of the Pharisee and the publican. Starting at verse 9. And he also told this parable, Jesus, to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself, saying, "God, I thank you that I'm not like these other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers. Thank you, God, that I'm not like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get." But the tax collector, standing some distance away, wasn't even willing to lift up his eyes to heaven. But he was beating his chest, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. In verse 14, the Lord Jesus says, I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. Doug Wilson writes about this verse. He says, the only blood that does not return with compounded guilt is the blood of Jesus. His blood comes to us for cleansing, not for condemnation. His blood does not return with guilt, and it's the only way that all the other guilt can be prevented from returning to us. So while the Spirit of Christ is alive in the world, the spirit of Herod is not yet gone. And the only way to expel that kind of darkness is to boldly proclaim that Jesus came into this world precisely to destroy this kind of darkness. And he will destroy it through his death and resurrection. This is a darkness that must be confronted by believers. Believers who are prepared to wield the gospel, not as a talking point, but as a real gospel for real sin, real balm for real pain, real light for real darkness. That's the call that I offer to you tonight. It's time to stop blaming them, and it's time to do what's right. Okay, so you got anything for us?
Beautiful. I just wanted to leave people with a couple of verses.
Okay.
One is Hebrews 10:23. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight.
That's beautiful. Well done. We don't plan those there, folks. So
no, we don't.
So that's good. That's
yeah.
excellent. And we want to thank you all for
thanks for
joining
being
us.
with us.
Yeah, thanks for being with us tonight. Apologies for a 4-hour show, but we'll cut this into clips so that you can have segments, make it more available, or we'll just present them again in shorter videos with different information. Maybe we'll do it that way, but we'll make it so that you can have these in smaller chunks, one way or another. A.W. Tozer said, "A scared world needs a fearless church." So which one are you? Are you scared? Or are you fearless?
No fear.
There's only one way to be fearless.
He is faithful.
You are, we're not really fearless. We fear God alone, because he's the one that must be feared. Man can't take anything from you but your life. And eternity with the Lord is a reward that we can't conceive here, but it's a promise that's made to us. So let's not be scared. Let's be a fearless church.
Amen.
So we'll play you out with this clip once again. God bless you, my friends, and we'll see you.
God bless you guys. We love you. Thank you for being here.
Indeed. We'll see you very soon.
The city, the state, and the county of LA wanted to shut Grace Church down. We sued them to stay open. We didn't accept any of the mandates, no masks, no distancing, no nothing. We were the church. The end of the case was that the state of California, the county of Los Angeles, said to us, we are giving you a permanent exemption from any invasion of the civil authorities again in the future of Grace Community Church. How could they possibly go from wanting to shut us down to giving a permanent injunction against that in the future? Because the one thing they could not afford to have was the truth. The reason it worked was because we didn't bend. You know, they would come back and say, okay, just do masks. And I said, no, And they say, well, just social distance. No. Well, just take everybody's temperature at the gate. No. We'll just have one entrance. No. Don't sing. No. Don't hug. No. And why did I say no all the time? Because you're not the head of the church. If I conceded to anything, I would have conceded that they had authority over the church. And then the argument on the First Amendment would have disappeared.